Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Place of Exiles in Maryland. I had always thought that I could escape from my past, that a change of scenery would help me forget everything that haunted me. After months of wandering, I ended up in Maryland. A place so quiet, so distant from the world I knew, I thought it would be perfect. The kind of place where no one asks questions, where you can be anyone or no one at all. The type of place that could offer me the solitude I desperately craved. I drove through the rolling hills, the landscape like something out of an old painting. A narrow road, overgrown with ivy and wildflowers, led me deeper into the heart of the state. I hadn't been here long enough to even settle in when I heard about the old farm. Local gossip was all the same, strange things happening there, people vanishing without a trace, and the occasional whisper of ghosts lingering like forgotten memories. It was all too convenient, this farm. Abandoned. Inexpensive. A perfect place to hide away from the world. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and the locals were just being superstitious, I thought. It had been empty for years. How could a place so old be anything more than an eerie relic of the past? But something about it tugged at me, something that didn't quite sit right. The farm was nothing more than a dilapidated farmhouse with a collapsing barn. The windows were boarded up, and the yard had long since surrendered to the creeping wilderness. It stood at the edge of a dark, dense forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching the land they had claimed back. Yet, there was something alluring about it. A certain stillness that filled the air when I approached, like the world itself had paused to take a breath. I felt a shiver, but I shook it off. I wasn't here for superstition. I was here for peace. So, I unpacked my things, locked the door behind me, and settled into my new home for the night. Little did I know that I had just stepped into a place where peace was the last thing I would find. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in hues of orange and purple, I could feel the weight of the place settling on my shoulders. The locals had been right about one thing: this farm had a presence. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like something waiting. The next morning, I decided to take a walk into the small town nearby, hoping to pick up a few supplies and perhaps clear my mind. The town was as quiet as the farm, a collection of weathered brick buildings and rusting street signs. As I strolled down the main street, the rhythmic sound of my boots against the pavement was the only noise. It felt like the world itself had forgotten about this place. As I passed by a small diner, a voice called out to me. "You're new around here, aren't ya?" I turned to see an older man leaning against the diner's doorway. His face was rough, his skin weathered from years of working under the sun. His eyes, though, were sharp and full of a certain knowing. He had that look in his eye, the kind you get when you've lived through something, seen things that others haven't. I nodded, a little unsure whether to engage. I hadn't expected to run into anyone so soon. "Just moved into the old farm on the outskirts," I said, trying to sound casual. The man's expression shifted at the mention of the farm. His lips tightened, and he leaned forward, looking both ways as though making sure no one else could hear. "That place, it's got history, you know? Folks around here steer clear of it." I raised an eyebrow, half amused. "What, you mean the place is just haunted?" He looked at me like he could see straight through me, then let out a low chuckle. Not haunted. Cursed, more like. But that's the thing, no one knows exactly why. People who stay there, they don't last long. Folks say you can hear things at night, voices, footsteps, some even claim they see them. The exiles, they say. The ones who never got to leave. I laughed nervously. Come on, you're telling me people believe in ghosts around here? The man didn't laugh. His gaze was as unblinking as the autumn sky. It's not about believing or not. It's about feeling what's been left behind. He paused, then added, some things, they don't leave, no matter how much you want them to. I shook my head, brushing off the tension in his voice. I'm not the superstitious type. I just need somewhere quiet to think. He didn't reply immediately, just gave me a long look before pushing himself off the doorframe. Well, I reckon you'll learn soon enough. Just don't say I didn't warn you. With that, he turned and walked inside the diner, leaving me standing there with a strange, lingering unease. I couldn't help but feel that his words, though dismissible at first, had dug their way into my thoughts. But I wasn't one to buy into local legends or scare stories. I'd stay at the farm. And in a way, I hoped that the man was wrong. Still, the air around me seemed heavier now, as if the town itself was waiting to see what I'd do. Despite the strange warnings, I was determined to stay. I had made my decision, and nothing, no matter how odd, was going to change it. The farm was my new beginning, and I wouldn't let whispers and superstitions get in the way. Besides, the man at the diner had seemed too eager to spook me. People like that were always looking for an excuse to tell a scary story. By dusk, I had unpacked most of my things. The farmhouse was as empty and forlorn as I had expected, with dust settling thick on the old furniture and the faded wallpaper peeling off the walls. The place seemed to hold its breath, as though it were waiting for something, or someone, to make it come alive again. I tried not to think too much about the dark corners or the way the shadows stretched across the wooden floors as the sunlight faded. I set up my bed in the back room, the only one that seemed relatively intact. The old house creaked and groaned as if it were settling, or perhaps it was just protesting the intrusion. I laughed at myself, reminding myself that an old house makes noises. Nothing supernatural about it. The evening passed quietly. I made a simple dinner, listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the windows. I sat at the small kitchen table, reading a book to keep my mind occupied, though I couldn't help but glance up every so often, my eyes drawn to the dimly lit corners of the room. When the last light of the day disappeared behind the trees, I turned off the lamp and prepared for bed. The house was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of branches against the walls. I settled under the covers, exhausted but too restless to sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it was nothing more than the faintest sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from somewhere in the house. I froze, listening. The sound came again, this time louder, as though someone, or something, was moving around upstairs. I told myself it was just the house. Old wood, old foundations, they creaked. Nothing more. But then came the footsteps. Soft, slow, like someone walking on the floorboards above me. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath caught. I strained my ears, trying to catch the rhythm, but the sound stopped abruptly. My mind raced, and I pulled the covers tighter around myself, trying to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps the house settling even more deeply into the earth. I stood up and crept toward the door, my feet silent against the floor. Slowly, I opened it just a crack, peering down the dark hallway. Nothing seemed out of place. The house was quiet again, the air heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. But as I stepped back into the room, I felt it. A chill that wasn't there before. The temperature in the room had dropped, and the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. I swallowed hard. "It's just the house," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. "Nothing to worry about." I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tight under my chin, trying to ignore the way my pulse still raced in my throat. But as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the last thing I remembered hearing was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, again. And this time, they weren't above me. They were right outside my door. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was cold, and the air felt thick, as though it were pressing against me. My eyes darted around the dimly lit space, searching for something, anything, that could explain the unease crawling along my skin. The footsteps from the night before were gone, but something had shifted. Something was different. The silence that had settled over the house was almost oppressive now. My breath seemed too loud in the stillness as I sat up, running a hand through my hair. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the clock, just after 3 a.m. The house was eerily still, the only sound the occasional whisper of wind outside. The window was cracked open, but the chill that crept in didn't explain the creeping sensation that something was moving in the dark. I pulled myself out of bed and walked cautiously into the hallway. As my footfalls echoed in the narrow corridor, I noticed something strange. The door to the room at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that when I went to bed. I hesitated, standing in place. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it had been open when I entered the room earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. Or perhaps the wind had pushed it. But then, I heard it. The soft creaking of a door, like something heavy was slowly moving, coming from the living room downstairs. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as the noise grew louder, closer. I turned and made my way down the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath me as if protesting the movement. The house seemed darker now, the shadows in the corners stretching like long fingers. I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw it. The living room door was now wide open. It hadn't been like that before. I was sure of it. I approached the door cautiously, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was so still now, too still. The silence pressed down on me, suffocating, making it hard to think clearly. I stepped into the living room, scanning the room, looking for anything out of place. The shadows danced in the corners, twisting and shifting, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I was just about to turn around when I saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing in the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes struggling to focus on the shape. It wasn't clear, not fully formed, but I could feel it, watching me. It flickered and was gone in the blink of an eye. I blinked, unsure whether my mind was playing tricks on me. I stepped forward, cautiously, my mind desperately searching for an explanation. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the figure hadn't left. Had it? I couldn't be sure. The house was old. It had to be some trick of the light, some shadow cast by the creaking beams. I reached the corner, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, bathed in the pale moonlight that filtered through the broken windows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. That something was still watching me, lurking just beyond my sight. I turned and walked quickly back to the hallway, but as I passed the kitchen, the door to the back porch slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I jumped, my pulse racing again. The wind, I told myself. It was the wind. I made my way back to my room, locking the door behind me. My mind raced, trying to find reason in the chaos. Old house. Old wood. The wind. It was just the house settling, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I pulled the blanket tightly over my shoulders, trying to calm my breath. The house felt heavier now, the walls closing in around me. And deep down, I knew whatever it was that moved through the shadows wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something had been there. Something still was. The night dragged on in an uneasy silence. I tried to sleep, but the weight of the house's presence, its strange stillness, kept me awake. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside seemed louder than it should be, as though the house was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, watching the shadows move in the corners of my room. I had never been particularly superstitious, but something about this place was starting to wear on me. It was around 4 a.m. when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a murmur in the distance. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it, convinced it was the wind or the old house groaning under its age. But no! There it was again, clear this time, soft whispers, like the sound of voices carried through the walls. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, just low, unintelligible murmurs, but they were unmistakable. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, a wave of cold creeping through my veins. There was no one in the house but me. I stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept toward the hallway. The whispers continued, growing louder now, but they didn't seem to come from anywhere specific. It was as though the very air around me had become charged with voices. They seemed to circle me, ebbing and flowing, moving in and out of my hearing, never quite clear enough to make sense of. I reached the top of the stairs and peered into the living room below. The faintest light from the outside crept in through the cracks in the windows, illuminating the shadows in a way that made them seem almost alive. The whispers were now louder, more distinct, but still impossible to understand. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just my mind playing tricks, I thought. Old houses make noises. It's all in your head. I walked down the stairs slowly, the whispers guiding me as if they were beckoning me forward. My feet felt leaden, my legs trembling, but I forced myself to continue. When I reached the living room, the whispers stopped. I paused, my eyes scanning the room, desperate for some sign of life, anything to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. The shadows seemed to shift as though they were watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the edges of my sight. I shook my head. It was the house, I told myself again. It was just an old building settling, the wind sneaking through cracks. Nothing supernatural. Nothing to be afraid of. But then, as I turned to leave the room, a voice, clear and sharp, as if whispered directly into my ear, sounded from behind me. Leave, now! I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, just as it had been a moment before. But the whisper lingered in my mind, its chill pressing against my skin. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey as I stood frozen, staring at the empty space around me. I should have turned and run, should have left right then, but something held me in place. Fear. Doubt. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks with my mind. But the longer I stood there, the more I couldn't shake the certainty that the voice had come from inside the room. That it was calling to me. That it was waiting for me. I hurried back upstairs, my pulse racing, the whispering still echoing in my head. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, even though I knew it wouldn't do anything to keep whatever was inside the house away. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, the isolation, too much quiet. It was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, a part of me knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. And it wasn't just old wood creaking under its own weight. Something was here. Something that wanted me to leave. Something that didn't want me to stay. And now, more than ever, I didn't know if I could. The morning after the unsettling night felt like a strange, surreal dream. I woke up, the echoes of the whispers still lingering in my mind, but the sun was shining through the cracked window, casting a warm light over the room. I tried to shake off the strange unease that had settled in my chest, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination. I had spent too much time alone in that old house, and the isolation had played tricks on me. I made myself coffee, the steam rising from the mug as I stared out at the fields surrounding the farm. Everything seemed calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The distant rustle of leaves in the wind was soothing, almost like a reminder that the world outside was still the same. I breathed deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't let myself get caught up in fear. After all, I had come here for peace, for solitude. I wasn't going to let an old house with its creaks and whispers drive me away. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the peacefulness of the morning, there was a constant nagging feeling, something lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. A feeling of wrongness, like something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I finished my coffee and decided to get to work unpacking the last of my belongings. Maybe I could distract myself by making the place feel more like home. As I moved through the rooms, however, I began to notice the small things that had started to shift, things I hadn't seen before. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, which I was sure had stopped ticking the day before, now seemed to be running again. I could hear the faint tick-tick-tick in the background, though when I had checked it yesterday, the hands had been stuck at 10 minutes past midnight. I stared at it for a long moment, but it was working now. I shook my head, thinking it must have just been my imagination playing tricks. Then, as I passed by the windowsill, I noticed something strange. A small, decorative doll, one I'd never seen before, was sitting on the edge of the ledge. I was certain I had never placed it there. Its glassy eyes stared back at me with an unsettling intensity, and the delicate porcelain face looked almost too lifelike. It wasn't my doll. I had no idea where it had come from. A chill ran through me as I reached out to move it, my fingers brushing against the cool ceramic. As soon as my hand touched it, I felt a sharp jolt of energy, as though the air around it had thickened. I quickly pulled my hand back, my pulse quickening. It's just an old decoration someone must have left behind, I told myself. It's nothing. But even as I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the room. That the doll hadn't been there before. That it was something. I moved on, deciding it was best not to dwell on it. I began sorting through some old crates, opening boxes of things that I had been meaning to sort. The house, despite its eerie atmosphere, was starting to feel a little more familiar as I adjusted to it. The daylight helped, and the normalcy of unpacking my clothes and books gave me a small sense of control over the situation. But as I opened one particular box, I noticed something else strange. A small scrap of paper, folded neatly and tucked inside the cover of a book, caught my eye. I didn't remember putting it there. I pulled it out, unfolded it carefully, and read the message scrawled on the paper. It never stops. It's always watching. Don't stay. My heart skipped a beat. I scanned the room around me, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. It was as if the house itself had shifted, as if it had taken on a new, more menacing presence. My mind raced with possibilities, but I tried to calm myself. I had to think logically. This could just be some old note from a previous owner, I reasoned. Maybe they had their own reasons for leaving. But the words on the paper felt too real. Too urgent. I folded the paper back up and placed it in the book again, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't afford to let fear take hold of me. I wasn't going to let this house, or whatever was in it, control me. But no matter how much I tried to push it down, the unease stayed with me. The house, the doll, the note, they all seemed like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Something was wrong, and the more I ignored it, the more it seemed to push back. As the day wore on, I found myself glancing nervously over my shoulder, constantly checking for things out of place. And though I could see nothing, hear nothing, the nagging sense that I was being watched, followed, never left. The house was silent, but somehow it felt alive. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the fields. The quiet isolation of the farm, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt more like a place frozen in time, a place that was not meant to be disturbed. I had to get out of the house, to see the land for myself, to try and shake off the unease that clung to me. Maybe if I explored a little, I'd feel more grounded, more connected to this place I was supposed to call home. The air outside was crisp, the ground beneath my boots soft with the remnants of an early frost. I walked toward the barn first, the wood creaking in protest as I pulled open the heavy door. Inside, it smelled of old hay and dust, and the floor was scattered with the remains of broken farming tools, rusted plows, shattered crates, and old barrels. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was something about the barn that made it feel alive. As if the past had left its mark here, like the walls themselves remembered the lives that had once moved through this place. I began sifting through some of the old boxes and crates, my fingers brushing against the brittle paper and yellowed cloth. Then, something caught my eye, an old wooden chest, tucked into a corner, half hidden beneath a pile of discarded blankets. It looked ancient, its edges worn and chipped, but the lock was intact, rusted with age, but still holding strong. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I couldn't resist. I knelt down and pried open the chest, dust motes floating in the faint light. Inside, I found an assortment of old photographs, letters, and trinkets, each item carefully placed, as though someone had left them behind with purpose. The photos were all black and white, most of them faded to the point where the faces were barely distinguishable. But there were a few that stood out, one in particular that made my stomach tighten. It was a family portrait, taken outside the very house I was now standing in. The people in the photo were dressed in worn, old-fashioned clothes, their faces stern and serious. The man in the center was tall, with a hard expression, while the woman beside him appeared to be holding a young child. A girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood in front of them. But what struck me the most was the figure behind them, a tall, thin shadow, almost invisible in the background, but unmistakable if you looked closely. It looked like a person, but their features were distorted, blurred as though they were never meant to be in the picture at all. I shuddered and quickly put the photograph aside, my hands trembling slightly. Just an odd picture, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I rifled through the rest of the chest, trying to distract myself. Among the letters, I found one that was particularly interesting, its envelope addressed to the house's previous owner, though the handwriting was shaky and uneven, as though written in haste. We've seen them again. The things in the shadows. The eyes are everywhere. It's not safe here anymore. We have to leave before it's too late. You've been warned. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I read the words. Who had written this? And what did they mean by the things in the shadows? Was this related to what I had been feeling in the house? The unease that had been bubbling beneath the surface began to boil over. Was this place really abandoned? I thought. Why was there no mention of any of this when I was looking for somewhere to stay? I decided to explore further, hoping that getting some fresh air would clear my mind. I wandered to the back of the property, near the overgrown fields, where the remnants of what used to be a garden were barely visible. As I walked, I noticed more and more objects that didn't seem to belong, a rusted metal swing hanging from a single chain on a tree, half-rotten, creaking in the wind, a set of old gardening tools, discarded and buried beneath the vines, and scattered, broken pieces of what looked like old furniture, now buried under a blanket of weeds and moss. It was strange. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt like something, or someone, had never truly left. I found myself drawn to a small, dilapidated shed at the edge of the property. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a cluttered interior. There were jars filled with dried herbs, some rotting and others still preserved, a collection of tattered books piled high on a dusty table, and a strange assortment of old candles. But what caught my attention the most was an old, weathered mirror leaning against the far wall. Its glass was cracked, but the reflection still seemed disturbingly clear. I took a step closer, feeling the familiar chill run down my spine. The mirror reflected the shed behind me, but it seemed off. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection, a shape that wasn't in the room with me. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse quickening. It's just the light, I tried to tell myself. The cracks in the glass are messing with the reflection. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the shed, something in the very air, was watching me, waiting. I hurried out of the shed, my breath coming in short gasps. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the farm in a soft, golden light. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt the walls of the place closing in on me. It was clear now. The farm wasn't just old, it was alive, in its own strange way. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of its history, and the more it seemed to draw me deeper into its mystery. But I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth anymore. That night, the air felt thick with tension, heavier than it had been in the days before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me, perhaps. I had always prided myself on being a practical, rational person, someone who didn't jump to conclusions, especially when it came to the unexplained. But the longer I stayed here, the more those rational thoughts began to slip away. I tried to push everything to the back of my mind. It's just an old house. Just an overactive imagination. Yet no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the sense of unease grew stronger with each passing moment. As I sat in the living room, the house was quieter than usual, the only sound the occasional gust of wind tapping against the window panes. I glanced toward the fireplace, where the flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting in the corners of the room as if they were alive. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just the light. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, I saw it. I was staring into the shadows when something caught the corner of my eye, a fleeting movement, a figure so faint, so insubstantial, that I wasn't sure if I had actually seen it at all. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But the longer I looked, the more real it seemed. A tall, thin shape, standing in the far corner of the room near the window. It was barely visible, like a shifting wisp of smoke or fog, but it was there. The figure was cloaked in darkness, and its outline seemed to blur and fade with every blink. It didn't have a clear shape, no recognizable features, just a vague silhouette that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the room itself. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My eyes were locked on the figure, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from it. Every instinct told me to get up, to run, to escape whatever this was. But I couldn't. The figure remained motionless, hovering in the corner, a shadow among shadows. It didn't make a sound. It didn't move. It was just there. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, I thought desperately. Maybe it's just a trick. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the less I could believe my own thoughts. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. And this time, it seemed closer, just a step forward, moving from the corner into the room. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to call out, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was a solid, suffocating weight in my chest, leaving me breathless. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't human. There was something wrong about it. It was more like a shadow, a thing not meant to exist in the light of day. It seemed to flicker, like an image on an old television screen losing its signal, the edges unstable, unsure of its form. I finally forced myself to move, stumbling backward, my legs weak and unsteady. But as soon as I took my eyes off the figure to turn toward the door, I heard it, a soft, low sound, barely audible but unmistakable. A whisper. "Leave, now!" I whipped my head around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, the corner where it had stood now just a normal, unremarkable part of the room. There was nothing but the dim glow of the fireplace and the creeping shadows. My hands shook uncontrollably as I backed away from the corner, my mind reeling. The whisper had been clear. "Leave, now!" Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? My pulse pounded in my ears, and I realized how fast I was breathing. The room felt suddenly suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me. I turned and fled, stumbling through the narrow hallway, practically throwing myself into the safety of my room. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged. For a moment, I just stood there, pressed against the door, trying to calm myself down. "It's just your mind," I told myself. "You're just tired. It's nothing." But deep down, I knew something had changed. The house, the land, whatever was here, it wasn't nothing. It wasn't a trick of the mind. I had seen it. Something was in that room with me. And it wasn't going to leave. I sank onto the bed, trying to steady my breath, but the silence in the room felt unnatural, too heavy. Even with the door shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing, whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. "Leave, now!" The words echoed in my mind, and I could no longer dismiss them as nothing more than a figment of my imagination. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been left behind, it was not going to let me go so easily. That night, sleep felt like a distant dream. The events from the day, the photograph, the strange figure in the corner, swirled around in my head, making it impossible to settle. I tried to lie down, tried to force my mind to shut off, but the oppressive silence of the house was broken only by the distant sound of the wind rustling outside and the occasional creak of old wood. But then, something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the house settling, or random noise. The floorboards were old, and I heard strange sounds before. But the footsteps were different. They were steady, deliberate. Slow, but distinct, coming from somewhere in the hallway outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. My eyes darted to the door, the shadows creeping in from the narrow crack at the bottom. The footsteps were getting closer, slow, deliberate, measured, each one echoing in the stillness of the night. I told myself it was nothing. A raccoon, maybe, outside the window, or an animal in the walls. There was a logical explanation for everything. But then came the voices. Soft murmurs, just beyond the door, barely audible. They weren't words at first, just low sounds, like a conversation held in whispers. But as the voices continued, they became clearer, more distinct. I could pick out a few words, fragments, really, like help, and don't, and something that sounded like it's coming. A chill swept over me, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voices were close, too close. My mind raced for an explanation. Could someone have broken into the house? It seemed impossible. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and the murmuring voices fell silent. A heavy, almost suffocating quiet descended on the room. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart. I waited, listening, my body frozen in place. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. But nothing moved. No more voices. No more footsteps. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle, almost afraid to touch it. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stay in here any longer. I had to know what was happening. I had to see for myself. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the handle, the door creaking as it opened just a crack. The hallway beyond was dark, the dim light from the living room casting long, thin shadows against the walls. There was nothing there. No one. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse quickening. The silence was deafening now. My eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual creaks of an old house settling, just the faint rustle of the wind outside. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my nerves. Get a grip, I thought. You're just hearing things. There's no one here. But the doubt lingered. There was a gnawing feeling deep in my gut that told me something was terribly wrong. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps soft against the worn carpet. I reached the end, where the staircase led down into the dark living room below. The house was completely still. No sign of anyone, no sign of anything out of place. Then, from below, a faint whisper drifted up. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel it. Something was waiting. The feeling hit me like a cold wind, biting at my skin, seeping into my bones. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness, where the whispering seemed to come from. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn and run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I descended slowly, my hands gripping the railing, my breath shallow. I could still hear the faint murmurs, now so soft that I could barely distinguish them. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. The house was silent again, but the air was heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. The living room was just as I had left it, empty, untouched. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving only the glow of the dying embers. I turned around, checking every corner. There was nothing there. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. But then, a soft click, like a door closing. I spun around, heart racing. There was a door at the far end of the room, one I hadn't noticed before. It was cracked open, just slightly, as if someone had entered and forgotten to close it all the way. I hadn't seen anyone pass by. I hadn't heard a sound. But there it was, open. The panic surged again, stronger this time, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. What was going on? I was alone, wasn't I? I had checked every corner, every room. But something in this house, no, something wasn't right. I stood there, frozen for what felt like hours, before finally gathering the courage to move toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. And as I opened it, the whispering voices grew louder, almost as if they were coming from inside the room. The darkness seemed to pull at me, like a tangible force, trying to keep me from stepping through. But I had to know. I stepped inside. Empty. It was just a small, windowless room filled with old, discarded furniture. The only thing unusual was the cold. It was colder than anywhere else in the house, the air thick and damp, as if the walls themselves were exhaling frost. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, hearing. The whispering was gone, but the weight of it hung in the air. Then, the footsteps started again, coming closer. And this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out who or what was making them. I don't know how I finally managed to fall asleep that night. The hours seemed to bleed together in a haze of unease and fear, my mind racing long after I lay down. The silence of the house was suffocating, and even with my eyes closed, I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. I had tried to dismiss everything. It's just nerves, it's just the house. But every time I closed my eyes, the images from earlier came rushing back, the shadowy figure, the whispering voices, the footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. And the room, the one I had entered, with its cold, suffocating atmosphere. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. That was when the nightmares started. I couldn't remember the details when I woke up, but I could feel the lingering sense of dread. Something had been in the dream. Something chasing me, something following me. Every time I tried to run, the ground beneath me seemed to give way, and I was falling into darkness, into the cold, suffocating void. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest, gasping for air as though I had been submerged in cold water. The room was still dark, the moonlight barely filtering through the thin curtains. My body was drenched in sweat, my clothes clinging to my skin. But it wasn't just the remnants of the nightmare that made me feel this way. There was something wrong, something off in the air. The house felt different. I looked around the room, my pulse racing again. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than before, as if the darkness had grown thicker, more alive. The silence was unbearable, pressing in from all sides. I could hear nothing except the pounding of my heart in my ears. I tried to sit up, but as I did, a wave of dizziness washed over me. My head felt foggy, my body like lead. It took every ounce of energy just to get my feet on the floor. I staggered to the window, pulling the curtain aside, desperate for a glimpse of the outside world. The moon was still high in the sky, the yard bathed in a pale, ghostly light. But it wasn't the outside that caught my attention. It was the feeling. The unmistakable sensation that something was watching me, waiting, lurking just outside my line of sight. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, pressing in from every direction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my chest tightened with fear. I turned quickly, scanning the room. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners, moving just slightly. I could swear I saw something, a faint outline, a shape that didn't belong. It flickered in the dim light, and before I could fully focus on it, it was gone. I froze, my body locked in place, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced. Was it real? Was I imagining things? No, it was real. There had been something there. I had seen it, just for a moment. It had been watching me. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, suffocating. It was as if the walls were closing in, pressing me down, squeezing the breath from my lungs. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just the house. You're just tired. But even as I whispered the words, I knew I couldn't shake the feeling that something was here with me. Something I couldn't see, but that was always just out of reach. Something that knew I was here, that wanted me here. I made my way to the door, hoping that getting out of the room, out of this oppressive atmosphere, would clear my head. But as I reached for the doorknob, the sound came again. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Moving just outside the door. I froze again, my hand inches from the knob. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside, just beyond the door. I could hear them as clearly as if someone were standing in the hallway. Who is it? I thought. Who's there? My mind raced, but my body was paralyzed, unwilling to move. The footsteps didn't stop. They were constant, relentless, drawing nearer with each passing second. I pressed my ear to the door, listening closely. The air was still. Nothing moved. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the presence beyond the door, waiting. For a moment, I thought I heard a voice, low and indistinct, like a whisper, barely audible through the wood. I took a step back, my heart pounding, my head spinning. The voices were back. Not the ones from the day before. No, these were different. These weren't whispers. They were calls, beckoning from beyond the door, inviting me to come closer. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't understand what was happening. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The exhaustion that clung to me was more than physical. It was psychological. Something was wearing me down, pulling me into a place where nothing felt real. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me on the other side. But the pull, the overwhelming sense of dread, kept me standing there, unwilling to move. And then, with a soft click, the door creaked open on its own. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder. Come to us. I couldn't take it anymore. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. Something was watching me. Something had been watching me all along, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The following days blurred together in a haze of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was slowly tightening its grip around me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its web. I tried to tell myself it was all just in my head. I was tired, I was on edge, and I had been alone for too long. But the longer I stayed, the more difficult it became to ignore the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, signs that something was terribly wrong. It started with the small things, objects moving on their own. I would leave a glass on the counter in the kitchen, only to find it somewhere else the next time I went to get it. A book that I had placed on the table would be open on the floor when I returned, as if someone had been reading it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had forgotten where I put things or hadn't noticed them falling. But the incidents began to increase, and I couldn't deny it anymore. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. At night, I would lie in bed, wide awake, listening to the sounds that filled the air around me. The first time it happened, I had thought it was just the wind, a trick of the house settling. But as the days went on, it became impossible to ignore. The voices weren't just noises in the wind. They were words, murmurs of sentences I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes, I thought I heard my name. Sometimes, I thought I heard someone calling me, urging me to follow them. But it wasn't the voices that terrified me most. It was the feeling that had settled over the farm, like a dark cloud hanging in the air. It wasn't just the house anymore. The land itself seemed alive with a kind of oppressive energy, heavy and thick. The air felt damp and musty, even when the windows were open. The lights seemed dimmer, even on the sunniest days, as if the very atmosphere was soaking up the daylight and keeping it trapped inside. I couldn't escape it. Each room seemed to hold its own presence, a silent watcher in the corners, lurking just beyond my sight. When I passed through the hallways, I could feel the walls closing in, pressing against me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The shadows seemed deeper than before, stretching unnaturally long across the floor, curling around the furniture as if they had a life of their own. One afternoon, while sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, I saw it clearly. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadows playing with my mind. But as I blinked and looked again, the figure remained just out of the corner of my eye, its form shifting and flickering. I turned my head sharply, but the figure was gone. I told myself it was nothing, a shadow, a reflection, a trick of my tired mind. But the cold that followed lingered in the air, hanging like a thick fog. Later that evening, the strange occurrences escalated. I was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, when I heard a loud crash from the living room. I rushed in, heart pounding, to find that the small coffee table I had left by the couch was now tipped over, its contents scattered across the floor. My first instinct was to look for some rational explanation, a breeze, a faulty floorboard, anything, but nothing seemed to make sense. The air felt charged, electric, as though something unseen had just made its presence known. I bent down to pick up the items, my hands shaking as I touched the spilled papers and a broken vase that had somehow rolled off the table. As I straightened up, the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch even further, pooling in the corners. I heard it then, a voice, clear as day, though it didn't come from anywhere I could see. It whispered my name again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come closer." I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was right behind me, too close. I spun back, but the room was empty. The chill in the air was suffocating, and the weight of something unseen pressed against my chest. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "It's here." The words were so clear, so distinct, that they vibrated in the air, ringing in my ears like an echo. Suddenly, the door to the back of the house slammed shut, so violently that the entire house seemed to tremble. I stumbled backward, eyes wide, but before I could move, the temperature dropped even further, and I could feel something behind me, watching. I could hear it, the scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor, coming closer, slowly. I spun around again, but nothing was there. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, a sickening, nauseating sense that I wasn't alone, that something was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around to acknowledge its presence. And then, as if in response to my fear, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, swirling around me like a tornado of voices. They were all around me, inside my head, outside my head, everywhere. It's not safe. You need to leave. The words sent a jolt of panic through me. The sound was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before it swallowed me whole. But I was frozen in place, unable to move as the shadows in the room twisted and writhed, coming to life, reaching for me, pulling at my very soul. And I could hear it then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, drawing closer, step by step. The house was never silent anymore. The strange occurrences had intensified, each day more unnerving than the last. The whispers never stopped. They seemed to follow me, reverberating in the walls, growing louder, pressing against my mind. And the air had become so thick, I could barely breathe without feeling the weight of it. The shadows were no longer subtle. They were alive, reaching for me, always watching, always waiting. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the creeping dread that had taken over the house. I convinced myself that I was being irrational, that there were logical explanations for everything. The creaking of the floors, the moving objects, the whispers, they could all be explained away. I told myself I was just tired, too isolated, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the gnawing sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was there, lurking just beyond my reach. It was one afternoon, while I was walking through the farmhouse, that I first saw it. I had been in the hallway, pacing back and forth, trying to shake off the unease that had been consuming me. The house felt colder than usual, the floorboards creaking underfoot with each step. I paused in front of a cracked mirror on the wall, staring at my reflection. My face looked pale, my eyes sunken with exhaustion. I barely recognized myself anymore. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway at the far end of the hallway. It was difficult to make out at first, just a shape standing motionless in the dim light. But as I blinked, the figure grew clearer, and I realized it was a person, a man, though not quite like any person I had ever seen. His form was translucent, his features faint, as if he were made of mist. He was tall, dressed in ragged clothing, his body hunched slightly, as though he were in pain. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest, the blood draining from my face. This wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow. This was a man, or at least something that looked like one, but I knew it wasn't alive. I could feel it in my bones. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with vacant eyes, his expression twisted with what I could only describe as distress, a deep, agonizing pain that seemed to radiate from him, filling the air around him like a thick fog. His face was gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days, his eyes hollow and sunken. He looked as though he had been through some terrible ordeal, as though he had suffered and was still enduring whatever torment had left him here, trapped. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn and flee from the sight before me. But my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the apparition that seemed to grow clearer with every passing second. It was as if I were caught in a trance, my fear and fascination locking me in place. Then, slowly, painfully, the figure took a step toward me. It was a small movement at first, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through my veins. I tried to move, to back away, but my legs were like lead, unwilling to obey. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the figure came closer, inch by inch. I could hear him now, the faintest sound, barely audible, like a low moan escaping his lips. The sound was filled with agony, a desperate cry for help that sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't know whether to run or stand my ground, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to escape this nightmare. But it was too late. The figure was right in front of me now, his face inches from mine. I could feel the cold emanating from him, the oppressive weight of his presence pressing down on me. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed on mine, and I could see the pain in them. So much pain. Then, in a voice that was nothing more than a rasping whisper, he spoke. "Help me." The words were broken, fragmented, as if they had been dragged from somewhere deep, somewhere ancient. I couldn't tell if he was speaking to me or to someone else, but I felt the weight of his plea. It was a call for aid, for release, for something that had been long lost. My heart raced, my breath shallow. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare into his eyes, watching as the despair and sorrow in them seemed to fill the entire room, the entire house. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure faded. He wasn't sucked into the floor or swallowed by the walls. No, he simply vanished, dissolving into the air like mist, leaving behind nothing but the lingering cold and the heavy, suffocating silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. My body was shaking, my hands trembling at my sides. My heart was still racing, but my mind was too clouded with shock to make sense of anything. I had seen a ghost. An actual ghost. And it had spoken to me, asking for help. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds, it could have been hours. But when I finally snapped out of the trance, I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I had locked myself in the room I had been sleeping in. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of my overworked mind. But I knew better. The cold still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The oppressive weight of the house pressed in on me from all sides. And I could still hear the whisper in my mind, echoing through my thoughts. "Help me." I didn't know what he wanted, or why he had come to me. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening in this house was not just a series of strange occurrences. It was something far worse, something I couldn't comprehend, something ancient and malicious. And it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't sleep after what had happened. The events of that afternoon, the figure, his voice, the cold, played in my mind on a loop, a haunting melody that I couldn't escape. I kept replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand it, but the more I thought about it, the less I was able to make sense of anything. The figure had been so real, so tangible, but his story, his suffering, remained a mystery, a piece of a puzzle I couldn't complete. I began to search for answers. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the urgency inside me grew with each passing day. I had to know what had happened on this farm, who these spirits were, and why they were trapped here. And so, I scoured every room of the house, looking for anything, old letters, photographs, anything that might offer a clue to the history of this place. It was in the attic, buried beneath dust and forgotten belongings, that I found it, a box filled with tattered, old photographs. Most of them were faded, the faces worn away by time, but some were clear enough to make out. There were people in the pictures, men, women, children, all standing in front of the very farmhouse I now called my temporary home. They were smiling in some of the pictures, but there was something off about their expressions, something hollow behind their eyes, a sadness that couldn't be explained. I sifted through the photographs, trying to make sense of them, when I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks, one particular photograph that had been stuck to the back of the others. It showed a man, tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and an expression that seemed both lost and tormented. He looked eerily familiar, but I couldn't place why. His clothes were old-fashioned, worn and torn, and his face seemed to mirror the same hollow emptiness that I had seen in the figure from earlier. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it be the same man? The one I had seen in the hallway? I turned the photo over, my hands trembling, and saw something written on the back in faded ink: John Hargrave, exiled from town, the guilty must pay. The words sent a wave of nausea through me. Exiled? Why? What had he done? I dug deeper into the box, hoping to find more answers, but the rest of the photographs were similar: faces, expressions of despair, of people who seemed to have lived in some other time, some other place. There were no dates, no names, just faces lost to history, their stories buried in the past. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only scratching the surface. And it was then, as I pored over the photographs, that the pieces began to fall into place. These weren't just random spirits. These were exiles, people who had been cast out, forgotten by the world, doomed to wander this land in a state of torment. They had lived here long ago, and whatever had happened to them had bound their souls to this place, trapping them in a cycle of suffering that they could never escape. I started to piece together the whispers I had been hearing. The voices in the night, the cold spots, the strange occurrences, it all began to make sense. These were the restless souls of those who had once lived here, who had died under mysterious and tragic circumstances, their fates sealed by the same land that had once been their home. John Hargrave, the man from the photograph, had been exiled. But what had he done? Why had he been cast out? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. I began to see a pattern, an unsettling truth. These figures were not just spirits, they were the forgotten, the ones cast aside by society, by their own people. They had been outcasts, exiled for reasons that no one cared to remember, condemned to live out their final days in isolation and pain. And now, their souls remained, trapped in the place of their greatest suffering, unable to find peace. As I continued to dig, I found more names: Martha Jenkins, William Rowe, Ellen Harper, all exiled, all condemned to wander the earth as restless spirits. Their deaths had been shrouded in mystery, but the town's history held whispers of dark deeds, of accusations and betrayal. Some had been accused of witchcraft, others of crimes that were never fully understood. What connected them all was the same fate. They had been driven away from their homes, forced to live in isolation, rejected by the very people they had once known. And now, they were all trapped, their souls bound to this farm, unable to move on, unable to escape the prison they had created for themselves in death. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this was not just a haunted house, it was a place of exile, a place where souls who had been abandoned by the living were condemned to wander for eternity, their cries unheard, their suffering never ending. And I realized with growing horror that the spirits I had seen were just the beginning. There were more, so many more, trapped here, lost in time, waiting for someone, anyone, to help them find peace. But the more I learned, the more I began to understand, helping them might come at a terrible cost. Because these spirits were not the kind that would simply fade away once their story was told. They were the exiles, the ones who had been forgotten, and now they were desperate to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. And they weren't going to let me go so easily. They would never let me leave. I had to get a grip. I couldn't keep letting my mind spiral out of control, falling deeper into the abyss of fear and uncertainty. The ghosts, the shadows, the whispers, the cold, it was all too much. I needed to think clearly. This wasn't happening because of some malevolent supernatural force. It couldn't be. There had to be a rational explanation for everything. I stood in the dimly lit living room, staring at the fireplace where the once steady flames now flickered erratically. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows with every gust, causing the house to creak and groan. I clenched my fists, trying to focus on the sound of the wind and the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. It's just the house settling, I thought. It's nothing more than that. The air was colder than usual, but the weather in Maryland had been unpredictable lately. The temperature could drop without warning, and the old farmhouse, drafty and decaying, had certainly seen better days. The chill could easily be explained by the lack of insulation, by the creaking pipes, the shifting beams. Nothing here was perfect, and the house had its quirks. I walked over to the window, peering through the grime-covered glass at the desolate field beyond. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow across the overgrown grass. The shadows stretched long, but they weren't alive. They were simply the product of the fading light, the curve of the land. There was nothing sinister about them. Nothing supernatural. Just the effects of the night, playing tricks on my eyes. I rubbed my temples. You're just tired, I told myself. You haven't slept properly in days. You're in a strange place, isolated. This is all just a result of stress. The mind plays tricks when you're under pressure. Nothing more. But then my thoughts wandered back to the photograph I had found, the face of John Hargrave, the man who had been exiled. That wasn't just coincidence, I tried to reason. You were just startled. Your mind is piecing things together to make sense of the fear. You're associating things that don't belong together. The whispers, there had to be a logical explanation for those, too. The wind could carry sounds from a great distance. The house was old, and the walls had absorbed decades of noise, of life. A small creak, a groan in the floorboards, could easily be misinterpreted as something else. I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hall last night, but perhaps it was just the house reacting to the cold, shifting as the temperature dropped. The wind outside could make distant sounds seem closer, distorting them. I had to remind myself that I was alone out here, far from the distractions of the town. My mind, in its solitude, was prone to imagination. I could almost convince myself that the ghosts were just a product of my stress, my fear manifesting in strange ways. The mind was capable of a great deal, especially when it was on edge. I paced around the room, trying to calm my breathing. There's no such thing as ghosts, I told myself. People don't just vanish from reality like that, leaving their souls behind. That's just folklore, stories told to explain the unexplainable. Nothing more than superstition. The townspeople were wrong. It's all in your head. I sat down heavily in an old armchair, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and tried to regain some semblance of control. I'm overreacting, I thought. This is just a house, an old, abandoned house, and all the weird noises, the chill, the shadows, they are just natural things caused by the environment. The wind, the creaks, the shifting timber, they are part of the house's natural decay. They're normal. But even as I told myself this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. A presence that lingered just beyond my peripheral vision. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that wouldn't fade, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. The house felt alive, and the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I realized I was lying to myself. It wasn't just the house creaking. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else. I stood up, determined to prove myself right, to chase away the lingering doubt. If I could just find a logical explanation for all of this, maybe the fear would fade. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way back up to the attic, where I had found the photographs of the exiles. I told myself it was just curiosity now, nothing more. I would look through the rest of the items, see if I could find anything else that made sense of the past. If I could just keep my mind occupied, maybe the fear would lessen. As I made my way up the narrow stairs, the house seemed to groan in protest, the timbers creaking underfoot. The attic was cold, dust motes swirling in the flashlight's beam. I looked around at the forgotten remnants of the past, old trunks, broken furniture, forgotten belongings of lives long gone. The place reeked of abandonment, of memories faded into time. I moved methodically, opening drawers, inspecting boxes. There was nothing unusual, nothing that screamed ghosts or tragedy. Just old clothes, worn books, letters yellowed with age. I sifted through them one by one, trying to convince myself that these were just ordinary items, relics of a bygone era. And yet, the air around me grew heavier, as though the shadows in the corners were pressing in closer, watching me. I paused. The whisper was faint at first, just a rustling of sound, barely audible. But it was there. I held my breath, my body stiffening. No, it's not real, I told myself, clenching my fists. It's just the wind through the cracks. The house shifting. Nothing more. But the whisper grew louder. I turned quickly, flashing the beam of light toward the source. Nothing. But I heard it again. Help me. I froze. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to obey. My heart thudded in my chest. I tried to call out, to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. Then, in the corner of the attic, I saw something shift. A shadow, just at the edge of the light. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to clear my mind of the terror that was suffocating me. It was just my imagination. It had to be. But deep down, I knew there was something in this house, something I couldn't explain. Something that had been waiting for me, just as I had been waiting for it. And no matter how many rational explanations I found, I couldn't deny it any longer. The spirits were real, and they were not going to let me go. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house seemed different somehow, darker, heavier, as though it were pressing on me from all sides. I went about my usual routine, but nothing felt the same. Even the air, thick with the scent of old wood and decay, felt suffocating. Every room I entered seemed to whisper a story of its own, a story I wasn't ready to hear. But the whispers were louder now, impossible to ignore. I had been avoiding the townspeople, keeping to myself since I arrived, not wanting to draw attention or stir up rumors. But I couldn't keep up the isolation forever. I needed supplies, a fresh set of clothes, and maybe even a little company. I had to get out of this house, if only for a short time. So, I ventured into the small town center, hoping to find a distraction, something to clear my mind. It didn't take long before the whispers found me. It started with a casual exchange at the local grocery store. The woman behind the counter, her name was Mrs. Crowley, smiled at me as she rang up my purchases. She was an older woman, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Staying at that old place on the hill, are you?" she asked, her tone almost too casual. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Yeah," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's quiet. Nice for a little getaway." Mrs. Crowley's smile faded, replaced by a tightness around her mouth. "Quiet, sure," she said, her voice lowering as she leaned in closer. "But it's not a peaceful quiet, if you know what I mean. That farm has a history. A cursed history." My pulse quickened. "Cursed?" She nodded gravely, lowering her voice further as though sharing a secret. "The Hargrave farm. It's been abandoned for years, but the rumors never died. People don't like to talk about it, but it's one of those places you just know to avoid. It's been haunted for generations. You wouldn't be the first person to feel things. People who've stayed there, they don't last long. There's something wrong with that place." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "What do you mean? What happened there?" Mrs. Crowley glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was listening. She leaned in even closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "The Hargraves were outcasts. The whole family exiled from the town. No one really knows why. People say it was because of their dark dealings, maybe witchcraft, maybe worse. They came to that farm and stayed there, cut off from everyone. And then, one by one, they all died under strange circumstances. Some say they were cursed, others think they brought something with them from the outside world, something dark. But whatever it was, it killed them. All of them." A chill ran down my spine as her words sank in. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, heavy with an unspoken warning. "The farm's been empty ever since," she continued, her voice tinged with fear. "But the land remembers, they say. And the spirits, they're still there, waiting. Anyone who stays too long, well, they don't come back the same. Or they don't come back at all." I wanted to dismiss her words, but a small part of me, one that had been trying to ignore the growing unease inside, couldn't. I had already felt the presence in the house, heard the whispers, seen the shadows. I had felt the farm's history pressing down on me, like the walls were closing in with each passing hour. And now, hearing these stories from Mrs. Crowley, it all seemed to make sense, or at least, the pieces started to fit together. I managed to give her a tight smile and a polite thank you, before quickly paying for my items and walking out of the store. But as I stepped outside, the bright sunlight did little to ease the chill that had settled in my bones. I walked down the street, my thoughts racing. The locals were right, I realized. Something was off about the farm, something that went beyond just the house's crumbling condition or the odd noises. The farm was cursed, and the ghosts that haunted it were not merely the product of a vivid imagination, they were real, and they had a story that needed to be heard. Or perhaps, they needed something more from me. I couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Crowley's warning. People didn't stay long at the farm. They didn't come back the same, or they didn't come back at all. The weight of the farm's dark history pressed in on me, suffocating and relentless. It wasn't just a house, it was a place of suffering, a place where lives had been ruined, where souls had been trapped. The more I learned, the more I realized that the spirits weren't the only things that lingered there. The very land itself was cursed, a silent witness to generations of pain and loss. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to admit that what I had been experiencing was not just the result of stress or overactive imagination. But as the stories from the locals continued to echo in my mind, I couldn't ignore the growing certainty that the farm had a history far darker than I had ever anticipated. And no matter how hard I tried to escape it, no matter how many rational explanations I came up with, I couldn't deny that the ghosts, the exiles, were waiting for me. And I feared they would never let me go. The days began to blur together, each one feeling like a shadow of the last. Time seemed to move differently here, as if the farm itself was manipulating it, stretching the hours into an unrelenting cycle of tension and dread. I had expected isolation to be calming, a break from the chaos of the world. But now, all I felt was the weight of it, the isolation, the silence that pressed down on me like an invisible hand. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me. It was the way it felt, heavy and suffocating. At night, I could hear the faint creaking of the floorboards, the whisper of wind through the cracks, but it was never the house that kept me awake. It was something else. Something deeper. Sleep had become a battlefield. I would drift off, exhausted from the weight of the day, only to be jolted awake moments later, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in my chest. The nightmares had begun, not the typical kind, but vivid, haunting dreams that felt more like memories than figments of my imagination. In one, I was standing in the very spot where I had first found the photographs of the exiles. The house around me was different, new, whole, alive with the presence of the family that had once lived there. But they weren't alive, not truly. Their eyes were empty, cold, lifeless. And yet, they stared at me, their faces twisted in silent screams, as if they were pleading with me to understand. I could hear their voices, though their lips never moved, whispering the same words over and over again. Leave, you don't belong here. I would wake up with a start, gasping for air, my chest tight as if the weight of their gaze had never left me. And it didn't. I felt it even now, as I sat up in bed, trembling in the dim light of dawn. I would glance around the room, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching across the floor. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me, something just out of reach. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, looming larger with every passing night. And every time I closed my eyes, they crept closer, inching toward me. The whispers, too, always there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I would hear them while I was awake, barely audible but unmistakable. Help me, help me. They didn't come from anywhere specific, but from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself seemed to hum with their presence. I began to feel as though the line between dream and reality was blurring. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was I still asleep, lost in a nightmare? Or was I awake, surrounded by the living dead of the past, trapped in this place with no escape? The more I tried to distinguish between the two, the more I found myself questioning everything. One morning, after another restless night, I ventured outside to try to shake the sense of unease that had been suffocating me. The sky was overcast, heavy clouds hanging low, mirroring the heaviness in my chest. As I walked around the yard, my mind swirled with thoughts of the Hargraves, of their tragic end, of the whispers and shadows that had haunted me since I arrived. The farm felt different today, less like a place of rest, more like a prison. I stopped by the barn, where I had seen the silhouette of a figure the day before, standing in the distance, just on the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps some animal moving in the shadows. But as I looked closer now, I saw nothing. There was no figure, no movement. Just the wind, pushing the branches of the trees in slow, rhythmic motions, their limbs scraping against each other like bones. But something felt wrong. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, steady, deliberate. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. I tried to breathe through the panic rising in my chest, to remind myself that it was just the wind, just the house, just the land playing tricks on me. I took a step back toward the house, but the air around me seemed to thicken. My steps felt heavier, as though the ground itself were holding me in place, reluctant to let me go. The house loomed in the distance, a hulking shadow on the horizon, and for a moment, I felt as if it were reaching out to me, pulling me back in. When I returned to the farmhouse, I found myself trembling, my breath shallow. The farm's weight was pressing down on me harder than before. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was the land itself, the earth beneath my feet, as though it were alive with the memories of the past. I could feel it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the air. It had all started so simply. I had come here seeking isolation, peace. But now, I was suffocating. And the ghosts, whether they were real or not, weren't just lingering in the corners of my mind. They were in the air, in the ground, in every creak of the house. They were all around me, and I couldn't escape. The nightmares became more frequent, more intense. The figures in my dreams were no longer silent. They spoke now, their voices distorted, garbled with pain. "You shouldn't have come," they said. "Leave now, before it's too late." I woke up each morning feeling more and more exhausted, my mind frayed on the edge. I could no longer tell if the dreams were the only thing keeping me awake, or if the waking hours had become the nightmare. I was losing myself, piece by piece. And with each passing day, I feared I was getting closer to losing more than just my mind. I feared I was losing my soul, too. The line between reality and nightmare was dissolving, and there was no escape. Not from the farm. Not from the past. Not from the ghosts. I had hoped that after the terrifying dreams and the sense of suffocating dread, things might eventually settle down. But the farm, it seemed, had no intention of letting me find peace. It started subtly at first, an object out of place, a chair knocked over, the flicker of lights that seemed more like a message than a technical malfunction. But then, the atmosphere shifted, darkening like the sky before a storm. I had been up late, pacing the house, trying to shake off the sense of something being there. I couldn't pinpoint it. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. That night, I entered the living room to find a chair pulled out from the table, and a cold gust of air swept through the room, despite the windows being shut tight. It was the first time I felt the temperature drop so dramatically. I shivered involuntarily, instinctively glancing over my shoulder. I wasn't alone. The whispers had become louder, insistent, and more chaotic. It was as if a chorus of voices was speaking at once, too many to comprehend, but all filled with a sense of urgency. Help us, leave this place." I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion. I had to stay calm. I had to remind myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, just the stress of being isolated, of hearing old stories and letting them get to me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The weight of the farm's history pressed on me, and the more I resisted, the more it fought back. I turned to leave the room, but before I could take a step, a sharp, stinging pain erupted across my arm. I gasped and looked down. For deep scratches, red and angry, marred my skin, as though something, or someone, had slashed at me with claws. The pain was immediate, burning, and I could feel the blood welling up beneath the surface of my skin. My breath hitched in panic as I instinctively pulled my arm to my chest, staring at the marks in disbelief. It's not real. I repeated to myself, but the sting of the scratches, the rawness of the pain, was undeniable. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, as I tried to process what was happening. But before I could gather my thoughts, a loud crash from the kitchen jolted me upright. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed toward the source of the noise. As I entered the kitchen, I froze. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the stove. A mug had been hurled across the room, shattered against the far wall. The pieces of ceramic lay scattered on the floor, the handle just inches from my feet. I stepped back slowly, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, of leaving this cursed place behind. But just as I turned to leave, I felt it, a sharp push, a forceful shove against my back. I stumbled forward, barely catching myself on the counter, my heart leaping into my throat. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, as if they were angry, as if the spirits, the exiles, were finally revealing their true nature. I tried to calm myself, tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on me. And then, just as quickly as the shove had come, it stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, and the only sound was my ragged breathing. I turned around, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow. Just a broken mug, the silence, and the oppressive weight of the house. I felt the sting of panic rise in my chest again. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the events, but there was no explanation for what was happening. I wasn't imagining it. The scratches were still burning, the broken mug still in pieces. And the presence, whatever it was, had just become violent. I stumbled back into the living room, trying to steady my breath, but then the worst thing happened. The room itself seemed to twist, the walls bending and groaning as if the house was alive, reacting to my fear. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The air was thick, suffocating, and my lungs burned as if I were struggling to breathe. Suddenly, something sharp hit the back of my head. I flinched and reached up to find a small piece of wood lodged in my hair, splinters digging into my scalp. I yanked it out with trembling hands, my fingers covered in a slick layer of sweat. My body was beginning to bruise from the force of these attacks, each one more violent, more real. I wasn't imagining this. I was being attacked. The exiles weren't just whispers anymore. They were angry, and I was their target. I couldn't stay here any longer, I realized. I had been foolish to think I could just leave everything behind, that isolation would heal me. Now, the very thing I had hoped would bring me peace had become my prison. I ran to the door, but as my hand gripped the handle, the temperature in the room dropped even further, the air growing bitterly cold. It was like the entire house had exhaled at once, and I felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on me. Then came the final blow. A loud, guttural sound, like a voice, but distorted, garbled with pain, came from the depths of the house. The floorboards beneath my feet began to shake, the sound of heavy footsteps reverberating from the walls. The force behind them was almost unbearable, as if the house itself were alive with rage. I couldn't move. The terror had frozen me in place. The whispers, the growls, the objects flying through the air, it all swirled together into a cacophony of chaos. I had to escape. But deep down, I knew there was nowhere to run. The farm had claimed me, and it wasn't letting go. The exiles had made their presence known. And now, they were angry. I could feel it now, the undeniable pull, like invisible chains wrapped around my body, holding me in place. The air was thick, saturated with something dark and oppressive, as if the house itself was a living creature, breathing down my neck, unwilling to let me go. I had never felt anything like this before, this visceral, gnawing compulsion to stay, even as my mind screamed at me to leave. I had to get out. The whispers in my head had turned into a maddening chorus, their words slashing through my thoughts like 1,000 jagged knives. You can't leave. You belong here. I had made up my mind. I had no other choice. The farm had already taken so much from me, my sanity, my sense of safety, and now it wanted my soul. The idea of escaping, of getting in my car and driving far, far away, was the only thing that made sense. I had to break free. The night had fallen once more, darker than usual, as if the shadows were deepening in anticipation of my departure. The farm seemed to grow heavier with each step I took toward the door, every creak of the floorboard beneath me like a warning. But I had no choice. I had to leave. I grabbed my jacket, my fingers shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. The cold wind outside promised freedom, a chance to breathe without the weight of this cursed place pressing on me. But as my fingers made contact with the handle, something stopped me. It wasn't the door that held me back, it was a force, something invisible and cold. It was like an unseen hand pressed against my chest, pushing me away. I tugged again, harder, but it felt like the door itself was resisting, as though it had become an immovable barrier. The whispering voices grew louder, distorted and frantic, their words echoing in my head, "You can't leave." My heart pounded as I tried to pull open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if something was holding it shut, as though the farm itself had grown sentient and was refusing to let me go. I stepped back, fear curling in my stomach, and looked around. The house seemed to loom over me, darker, more alive than before. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally, flickering like the flames of a dying fire. I heard the scraping sound of something moving in the distance, and for a moment, I wondered if it was just the house settling, if it was just another trick of my exhausted mind. But the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. It was like footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching me from behind. I whipped around, my pulse racing. The room was empty. No one was there. Just leave, I told myself. Get in the car, drive away, and never look back. But as I turned back toward the door, something within me hesitated. There was a pull, a strange sensation in my chest, as if something inside me was telling me not to leave, that I had to stay. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape this madness, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had betrayed me, unwilling to heed my own command to flee. Every fiber of my being told me I was in danger, but my feet felt cemented to the floor, my hands unable to release their grip on the door handle. The whispers were becoming more desperate now, pleading with me. Stay with us, stay here, you can't leave. I took a step back, trying to shake the feeling, trying to regain control, but the sensation only grew stronger. My head swam, dizziness crashing over me like a wave. It felt as though the house was absorbing me, draining my will, feeding off my fear. Every thought I had was clouded by an overpowering urge to remain. This place wants me, I thought, feeling the blood drain from my face. It won't let me leave. It wasn't just a supernatural presence anymore, it was something deeper, something internal. There was a force inside me, urging me to stay, and I couldn't fight it. It felt like the farm had planted roots inside my mind, and those roots were sinking deeper, anchoring me here. I tried again, harder, desperate. I yanked at the door, my body shaking with exertion. But once again, it was as if the house was resisting, a physical force pressing against me, pushing me back with an invisible hand. I felt my knees buckle under the pressure, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as my legs gave way beneath me. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands scraping against the hardwood as I tried to push myself back up. The whispers were now a constant hum in my ears, impossible to ignore. Stay, stay, stay. I could feel it now, the weight of the exiles pressing in from all sides, their presence growing stronger, more demanding. It was as if they were trying to pull me into their world, to keep me there with them. They didn't want me to escape. They wanted me to be a part of their curse, to join them in their restless, tortured existence. I could feel the walls of the house closing in on me, the air so thick now I could barely breathe. The very ground beneath me felt unstable, as though it, too, were pulling me down, deeper into its grasp. I stood up shakily, unable to look away from the door that refused to open, the air that seemed to suffocate me. I have to leave. My mind screamed it, but my body refused to obey. I was caught between two worlds, the world I knew and the world I was being dragged into by something older, darker, something that would not let me go. With my last ounce of strength, I finally turned away from the door, my eyes scanning the room for any way out. But I knew it, there was no escape. Not anymore. The farm had claimed me, body and soul. It was a prison, and I was its prisoner. The air felt different that night, heavier, almost charged, as though the house had become a conduit for something raw and aching, something far older than I could comprehend. The whispers, once incoherent and maddening, had quieted, replaced by a deep silence that filled the room with a sense of oppressive anticipation. And then, as though the house itself had decided it was time to speak, the voices came. Clear this time, but just as unsettling. It began with a soft, almost melodic hum, like the wind, but it was distinct, human. Slowly, the voices began to shape themselves, no longer whispers, but full sentences. At first, they came from different directions, swirling around me like a cloud of disembodied sorrow. Each one was different. Some were low, gravelly, filled with pain, others soft, desperate, pleading. We were forgotten. We died alone. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest, my mind screaming for me to run, to escape the voices that had now fully manifested, filling the room with their endless, mournful wails. My body refused to move, as if the very air had turned to quicksand. Every muscle in my body froze, caught between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming need to understand, to hear them. A cold chill crept along my skin, settling deep into my bones. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by fear. The ghosts, undeterred, continued their mournful narrative. We were exiles, cast out. We had no place, no home. The voice was female, trembling with sorrow. I couldn't see where it came from, but it felt as though the words wrapped themselves around me, squeezing tighter with each breath I took. I could feel it now, the despair, the hopelessness. Their voices, once desperate, began to intertwine into a chorus of shared grief. They were telling their stories, revealing the terrible truth of their fate. Each one was a tale of cruelty and injustice, a people forced out, punished for reasons that no longer made sense. Exiled, abandoned, left to die in the cold, unforgiving wilderness of the farm. We were never meant to die like this, a male voice broke in, the tone jagged, filled with a bitterness that made my skin crawl. We didn't deserve this fate. We were betrayed. My mind reeled. I had thought of them, these ghosts, as mere phantoms, twisted apparitions, born from the tortured imagination of a deranged mind. But now, they were real, undeniably real, and their pain was raw, palpable. The air felt thick with their sorrow, with their regrets. They were speaking not just of their deaths, but of their lives, of what had led them to this cursed place. We died alone. In pain. In fear. No one cared, another voice murmured. It was old, brittle, like the very walls of the house had spoken. And so we linger, waiting for someone to understand. Their voices began to overlap, and I struggled to keep up with their tragic histories. Exiles, every one of them, some from distant lands, some from their own communities, cast out for reasons that no longer mattered. Some had been wronged by love, others by betrayal, others by simple misfortune. But all of them had suffered the same fate, death, alone, at the hands of an uncaring world. I felt the weight of their stories settle upon me. They were real people, once. Real lives that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. They had not asked for this curse, not asked to be trapped between life and death, condemned to wander the halls of this forsaken place, their spirits unable to rest. "You're like us," a voice whispered, low and guttural. It sent a shiver of cold fear racing down my spine. "You've already started to feel it, haven't you? The weight of the farm's curse. The chains are tightening." I wanted to deny it, to scream at the ghosts, to tell them they were wrong. But the truth was, I had felt it. Their curse had already begun to sink its claws into me. I could feel their presence in my thoughts, in the darkness that had settled into my chest. I could no longer tell where my fear ended and their sorrow began. Another voice spoke, softer, almost tender. "We were given nothing, but we can give you something." The words were not comforting, but they were filled with a strange warmth, a beckoning. "Join us. You won't be alone. You understand our pain. You'll be one of us." The invitation hit me like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of my resolve. The ghosts were offering me something that was both terrifying and enticing. Would I be free from the endless terror of this place? Or would I join their restless, eternal suffering? I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back, to reject their invitation and escape this nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. The farm had already taken root in my mind. And as much as I hated to admit it, a part of me, some dark, twisted part of me, was tempted. The idea of becoming part of something bigger, something eternal, was pulling at me, just as it had pulled at them all those years ago. The voices pressed in, their words a constant hum, a dissonant melody of pain and longing. "You can leave, but you'll never be free. You'll always carry us with you. Always." I closed my eyes, my hands trembling as I clutched at the fabric of my shirt. My heart pounded in my chest, the noise in my ears deafening. I wanted to escape, but I knew that I couldn't. There was no escape from the farm, from the ghosts, from the curse that had taken hold of me. "We are part of you now," the voices whispered, "and you are part of us." I opened my eyes, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw them, the exiles, standing before me, their figures blurry and indistinct, their faces filled with sorrow. They had become part of me, as I had become part of them. I wanted to flee, to scream and run, but I was rooted to the spot, my body betraying me, drawn in by their tragic stories and the awful truth that I could never be free of this place. And so, I stood there, caught between the ghosts of the past and the terrifying reality of my future, torn between fear and sympathy, unable to escape the fate that awaited me. The farm had never felt alive like it did that night. The wind had stopped, leaving behind a suffocating stillness, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. The shadows stretched long and twisted, curling like fingers, creeping over the walls of the room as if the house were conspiring against me. The whispers had quieted, but something far worse had replaced them, an absence. A sudden, sharp cry pierced the silence. It was a scream, raw and guttural, filled with agony. The sound shattered the stillness in an instant, slicing through the thick air like a blade. My heart skipped a beat, the sound echoing in my ears, reverberating in the walls around me. I froze, my blood running cold. It was a sound of torment, a desperate plea for help, for release. And it came from the house itself. No, no more, I whispered to myself, barely recognizing my own voice. It was the scream of someone who had suffered too long, someone who had been trapped in this place as I had, only to be forgotten. But I couldn't forget it. I couldn't ignore it. I rushed toward the source of the sound, my legs trembling beneath me, each step heavy as if the very floor beneath me resisted my movement. The house groaned, the walls seeming to close in on me, but I couldn't stop. I had to see, had to know what had caused that cry. As I entered the hallway, the temperature dropped sharply. The once familiar scent of dust and old wood was replaced by something metallic, something sharp and acrid, like blood. The hallway stretched before me, too long, too dark, the shadows almost alive. And in the distance, I saw it. A figure. A silhouette in the doorway at the end of the hall. It wasn't like the other figures I had seen before. This one was different, more real somehow, its outline sharp against the blackness, its shape almost human. But there was something wrong with it. The air around it shimmered, like a heat wave, but colder, distorting the space. The figure turned. It was a man, no, it was a man, once. His face was gaunt, hollowed out as if his flesh had been worn away by time, leaving only skin stretched tight over bone. His eyes. I couldn't bear to look at them. They were empty, black pools, endless and void. Help me, the word came in a rasp, broken, desperate. His voice echoed down the hall, filling the space around me, suffocating me with its heaviness. Please, help. The air seemed to vibrate with his plea, the walls around me groaning in response, as if the house itself were answering. And then, in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just the past bleeding into the present. It was something much worse. The spirits here, the exiles, were trapped. Their souls couldn't move on, couldn't find peace. They were reaching out, not just in search of understanding, but for deliverance. The house had been built on the ruins of their lives, their untold stories, and their unresolved pain. I was not just a visitor, I was a witness, and I could no longer turn away. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I had feared them, yes, but I had also ignored them, assuming they were just ghosts. But now, looking at this tortured soul, I saw the truth. These were people. They were real. Their lives had ended in violence, in betrayal, in suffering. And their suffering was endless. Please, help me, help us, the figure repeated, his voice now a frantic grasp. The desperation in his voice echoed in my chest, rattling the foundation of my resolve. I had tried to leave. I had tried to escape this place, but the fawn had refused to let me go. I had run from the truth, from the ghosts, but now I could no longer ignore it. These spirits weren't the ones who needed to be silenced. I was the one who needed to act. I had come here for peace, for isolation, to escape the chaos of my life. But what I had found instead was a prison, not just for me, but for the lost souls that wandered the halls. They were bound by their pasts, by their deaths, by a curse that no one had ever dared to end. I knew then what I had to do. I had to confront them, not as a frightened trespasser, but as someone who understood. I had to face the ghosts head-on and end their suffering once and for all. I had to break the curse. The decision hit me with a force I couldn't describe. There would be no turning back from this. No more running. No more hiding. I would stand face to face with whatever malevolent force held this place, with the ghosts of the exiles, and I would do whatever it took to release them from their eternal torment. The room around me seemed to shift, as if the house itself was preparing for what was to come. The temperature dropped further, the shadows deepened, and the whispers started again, soft and mournful, urging me on. I knew I was no longer alone. The spirits were gathering around me, watching, waiting. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I couldn't be. I would face them, and I would end this. The ghosts of the exiles would not suffer forever, not if I had any say in it. I was their last chance, and I couldn't walk away now. I turned toward the stairs, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my chest like a stone. Every step felt like it would be my last, but I didn't falter. The time had come to confront the darkness. With every step, the house seemed to groan in anticipation. I was ready to end the haunting, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. I wouldn't be a victim any longer. I would free them. The house felt different now, as if it was waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with anticipation, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified. It was as if the farm itself had grown aware of my decision, sensing that something was about to shift. The whispering had become louder, more insistent, urging me forward. But now, I wasn't afraid. Now, I had a purpose. The hallway stretched before me, darker than it had ever been, the shadows gathering like ghosts in the corners of my vision. I could hear the soft footsteps of the spirits, their movements just out of reach. They were all around me, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. And I knew, they knew, that I was ready. I took a deep breath and stepped into the heart of the house. The kitchen, once a familiar room with the remnants of a once-lived life, now seemed like a stage set for something darker. The walls were closing in, the floor cold beneath my feet. I could hear the scraping of furniture being moved, a soft, guttural hum rising from the corners of the room. And then it began. A voice, sharp, cold, unmistakable, cut through the thick silence like a knife. "You should leave." It was the same voice I had heard before, the one that had whispered in my ear, the one that had called to me. It came from behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just the empty space, filled with the weight of history. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to retreat, to turn and run. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I won't leave. Not until you tell me what's going on here." The air around me shifted, vibrating with a low hum. The temperature dropped, the shadows growing longer, twisting in unnatural angles. The spirits were near, they were listening. "You don't understand." The voice came again, this time from somewhere deeper, the words laced with pain. "It's too late to change anything. It's never too late." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. The defiance in my tone surprised me, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them control me any longer. "You are all bound to this place. I can feel it, your suffering, your anger. I don't care if it's too late. I will make it stop." The room seemed to pulse with a low growl, like the very walls of the farm were alive, breathing with me. But the spirits, no, the exiles, were no longer silent. They began to speak, their voices overlapping, a chorus of agony. "We were wronged. We were abandoned. We have no peace." I stood my ground, my legs trembling, but I refused to show weakness. "Tell me what happened. Why are you here? Why can't you move on? The house creaked and groaned, the floorboards bending under an unseen weight. And then, a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I didn't need to look to know that it was one of them, one of the exiles, trapped and restless. The figure approached, its outline growing clearer. This time, I could make out the details of its face, a gaunt woman, her eyes hollow and distant. Her mouth moved, but no sound came from it. You don't understand, her voice came, soft and broken. We were cast out. Left to die. I could feel the sorrow radiating off her, her pain almost suffocating. It was a weight I couldn't escape, but I had to try. I can understand, I said, my voice quieter now, but firm. I can feel it, your anger, your grief. I know you're trapped here, but I can help you. You don't have to stay in this hell. There's still time to end it. Tell me how. The woman's form flickered, her figure becoming blurry, like smoke dissipating in the wind. Her eyes widened in desperation. You can't help us. We've been forgotten. We've been forsaken. No, I said, stepping closer, my heart pounding in my chest. You haven't been forgotten. You're not alone. I'm here now. I'll help you break this curse. I'll find a way. Her figure began to shift again, becoming less tangible, her voice trembling as if the very act of speaking drained her. There's no way out. We're bound to the land, to this farm. It won't let us go. We're the outcasts, the exiles. We can never rest. The truth of her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just some haunting. This was something much deeper, something older. The farm had claimed them, bound their souls to the land, and in doing so, had created an unbreakable cycle of torment. The curse wasn't just a product of the past, it was a part of the land itself. It had fed on their suffering, feeding on their endless pain, and now it had latched onto me, too. But I wasn't going to let it win. I raised my voice, the words echoing through the house. I will find a way. If I have to destroy this farm, I will. If that's what it takes, I'll do it. For a moment, there was silence. The whispering stopped. The shadows ceased their movements, holding their breath. And then, in a low, mournful tone, the woman spoke again. You will try. But be warned, child. The farm won't let go so easily. It doesn't want to be free. It wants to keep us, keep you. I stood taller, my resolve hardening with each word. I'm not afraid of the farm. I won't be its prisoner. The figure flickered one last time, her eyes full of sorrow, and then she was gone. The oppressive presence in the room remained, but I could feel the shift. The exiles were waiting for me to act. I had made my choice. I would confront the curse head-on, fight to release the souls of the lost, and end the suffering that had plagued this farm for so long. And I wouldn't leave until I had broken the chains that bound them all. I had expected resistance. I had expected fear. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. The moment I spoke the words, I will destroy this farm if I have to, the atmosphere in the room shifted, became electric. The temperature plummeted again, colder than ever before, and I could feel the weight of the exiles' anger pressing in on me from all directions. Their voices, once soft and mournful, now sounded like a low growl, a collective hiss of fury. A sudden, sharp gust of wind slammed into me, knocking me back. I stumbled, barely catching myself against the crumbling wall. The walls groaned under the pressure, and the room began to shake, violently, as if the house itself were coming alive. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. And then I saw them. Figures. Shadowy forms emerging from the dark corners of the room, moving with unnatural speed, their faces twisted in agony and rage. Their eyes, black and empty, fixed on me, their hollow stares colder than the night air around us. The first figure lunged at me, its movements jerky, like it wasn't entirely tethered to this world. I barely had time to react as its hands reached out, clawing at my throat. It was impossibly strong, its fingers cold as ice, sinking into my skin like daggers. "No!" I gasped, struggling to break free. My breath came in ragged bursts, my body trembling, but I couldn't get away. I had to survive. I had to escape. The figure tightened its grip, and everything went dark for a moment. The sounds around me faded, the air grew thick and heavy. My vision blurred. No, not now, not like this. I fought with everything I had, slamming my palms into its chest, trying to shove it away. And then, suddenly, it was gone. I hit the floor with a crash, gasping for air, every nerve in my body on fire. I scrambled to my feet, but I didn't have time to think. The room was alive now, pulsing with their rage. The ghostly figures were everywhere, converging on me, their movements erratic, their eyes burning with hatred. They were angry, furious. I reached for anything I could use as a weapon, my hands landing on a rusted piece of metal lying on the ground. It was cold and jagged, but I didn't care. I didn't have time to be scared. The second figure attacked from my left, a man, his face covered in blood, his mouth open in a silent scream. He raised a hand, his fingers elongating into claws, and lunged for my face. I swung the metal rod at him with all my strength. It hit with a sickening crack, knocking him back, but he didn't fall. He staggered, then charged again, faster than before. I barely dodged. He was too quick, his movements unnatural, like he was driven by pure rage. "I won't stop until you leave," I shouted, my voice raw with desperation. I swung the metal rod again, catching him across the chest, but it felt like hitting a brick wall. His body didn't yield. As I fought, the walls of the house trembled again. The floorboards cracked underfoot, and the house let out an audible moan as if it were alive and struggling. The temperature continued to drop, the air so frigid now that I could see my breath puffing out in white clouds. The weight of the house seemed to press down on me, urging me to submit, to give in to the terror that surrounded me. But I couldn't. Not now. I swung again, my arms burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The figures were closing in. One grabbed my arm, its touch freezing and sharp, like needles digging into my flesh. The ghost didn't let go, its grip tightening until I could feel the blood draining from my limb. I screamed, but no sound came out. Another figure, a woman, emerged from the shadows behind me. Her face was covered in ragged scars, her eyes sunken and hollow. She reached for me with clawed hands, and for a moment, I thought she would rip my throat out. I fought harder, using all my remaining strength to wrench myself free from the man's grasp and push the woman away. The metal rod slammed into her chest, but again, it felt like nothing. They didn't feel pain. They were relentless. "Why won't you let me leave?" I screamed, more to myself than to the figures. "What do you want from me?" The spirits only responded with their hollow eyes and tortured, silent screams. They wanted me to understand. They wanted me to break. But I refused. A sudden, violent crash from above, like 100 things falling at once, distracted me for a moment. I looked up to see a beam break loose from the ceiling. The house was falling apart, the weight of years of pain, anger, and despair coming down all at once. It was as if the very structure of the place was trying to crush me, trying to bury me under the weight of its history. I ducked, barely avoiding the falling debris. But as I moved, one of the figures lunged at me again. This time, there was no dodging. Its hands wrapped around my throat, tightening like a vice. I fought back, desperate, reaching out for anything that could save me. My fingers brushed against the edge of a broken mirror on the ground, and an idea struck me. The mirror. It had to work. I grabbed it, feeling the sharp edges cut into my hand as I raised it up between me and the spirit. The figure hesitated for a split second, confused by the reflection. It recoiled, its hands pulling back just enough for me to break free. I swung the mirror at it, using the sharp edges to push it away. The figure shrieked, a sound so high-pitched it sent a chill through my bones. It stepped back, its body flickering and distorting like it was made of smoke. For a moment, I thought it would vanish entirely. But then, it lunged again. I didn't have time to think. I swung harder, this time driving the shard of glass into the spirit's chest. The figure let out a low, guttural cry, and for a moment, I saw something else in its eyes, a glimpse of the person it had once been. Then, with a final, trembling flicker, it vanished. The room fell silent. The oppressive pressure that had been squeezing the life from my lungs lifted, just enough for me to breathe again. But it wasn't over. The other spirits were still here. They wouldn't give up that easily. I wasn't finished either. With a deep breath, I gripped the mirror tightly, ready for whatever came next. I wasn't leaving until I uncovered the truth. I stood in the middle of the room, the broken mirror still clutched tightly in my hand, its jagged edges biting into my palm. My heart raced, my breath shallow, and yet, for the first time since I arrived at the farm, I felt a strange calm. The immediate threat had dissipated, but I knew the ghosts weren't gone. They were still here, lurking in the shadows. I could feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Then, it happened. A voice, a soft whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind, slipped into my mind. "You don't understand." I froze, eyes wide, my pulse quickening again. I wasn't sure if I had heard it aloud or if it was just in my head, but I knew it wasn't just a trick of the wind. It was the voice of one of the spirits. The air grew colder once more, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was filled with a sorrow, an overwhelming sadness that pulled at my chest. My gaze darted around the room, but no figure appeared. Only the faintest movement in the shadows. Then, the voice came again. "You have to know the truth." I shook my head, my mind racing. I wanted to run, to escape, but the words held me in place. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not while I was so close to understanding. "We were wronged," the voice continued, its tone full of anguish. "We were exiled, cast out without cause, and left to die alone. Forgotten. Abandoned. Now, we cannot rest. Not until we are heard." I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, and a figure began to materialize in front of me. Slowly, like smoke forming into shape, the apparition of a man appeared. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his mouth stretched into a twisted grimace. But there was something in his eyes, something deep and painful, that kept me rooted to the spot. "We were betrayed," he said, his voice trembling. the ones who lived here before us. They cast us out, calling us traitors, criminals, when all we ever wanted was to survive. They left us to starve, to die in the dark. And now, we are cursed to wander these lands, trapped in the agony of our final days. I took a step forward, unable to tear my eyes away from him. The figure's form flickered with each word, but it didn't fade away. I could feel his pain, his rage, and energy that pulsed through the air like a living thing. I had no words. I just listened. They didn't care for us. They didn't care about what we had done. We were scapegoats, marked for death, and we paid the price with our lives. The curse, it's not just the farm. It's the world. The injustice, the betrayal. It binds us to this place. We can't move on until we get justice. Until we're heard. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the weight of his words, the heavy burden of unspoken truth. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't a random tragedy. These weren't just lost souls. These were people, real people, who had been torn apart by lies and left to die in isolation. And now they sought something from me, not revenge, not hatred, but closure. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, but before I could, another voice broke through the air, a woman's voice, full of sorrow. "Please," she whispered, her form appearing beside the man, pale and translucent. "We need you to understand. We need you to remember us. We need you to make them see what they did to us. We need to be heard." The two figures stood before me, their eyes pleading, their faces etched with the anguish of those long forgotten. I could see it now. These were the exiles, the ones who had been cast aside, their names lost to history. They had suffered, died alone, and now their souls wandered, trapped in the same place they had been abandoned. "You must know," the man's voice echoed again, growing more urgent. "It wasn't just the land that cursed us. It was the betrayal, the lies, the ones who forced us to leave. They are the true source of our pain. We are nothing but shadows, fragments of our former selves. But we are not truly gone. Not yet. Not until we are remembered." I felt the weight of their words settle deep within me. These spirits were not just haunting the farm. They were crying out for recognition, for justice. They wanted to be remembered, not as outcasts, but as victims, people whose lives had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. And their spirits were trapped in that agony, forever bound to the land where they had been forsaken. The revelation was clear now. The curse that bound them to this place wasn't born of evil. It was born of betrayal, of cruelty. And in that betrayal, they were seeking a voice, a way to be remembered. They weren't looking for revenge, as I had feared. They were searching for closure, for recognition of their suffering. But how could I help them? How could I give them the peace they so desperately sought? The woman's eyes, full of sadness, locked onto mine, and for the briefest moment, I felt something stir within me, a deep, undeniable sense of compassion. I understood now. They didn't want to remain trapped forever. They wanted to move on. And I was the key. "You are our last chance," she whispered. "Please, help us." I didn't know what I could do, but one thing was certain. I couldn't leave until I found a way to give them what they needed. They had been wronged. Their suffering had been silenced for too long. It was time to make their voices heard. The air in the room was thick with the weight of the ghost's plea. I could feel their presence surrounding me, the tension in the atmosphere pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. Their eyes, full of pain and longing, never left mine. I could sense the desperation in their voices, a growing urgency in their whispers. "Please," they begged again, "help us. We can't move on without you." I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing with thoughts of how to release them. I had no idea what I could possibly do to end their torment, to lift the curse that bound them to this forsaken farm. I had no knowledge of rituals, no connections to anyone who could help. But there was one thing I had learned over the course of my time here: these spirits were not vengeful. They were not angry at the world. They were angry at being forgotten, at being dismissed. They needed someone to acknowledge their suffering, to understand it, and to let the world know what had been done to them. I glanced down at the shattered pieces of the mirror still in my hand, a symbol of brokenness, perhaps a reflection of their fractured lives. The image of their final moments seemed so vivid in my mind now. The isolation, the betrayal, the death they had faced alone. It was unbearable, the thought that they had been cast aside and forgotten. "What can I do?" I whispered aloud, more to myself than to the spirits. "What can I do to help you?" Their faces grew more intense, their forms flickering, but still, they didn't speak. Their silence pressed down on me like a weight I could barely carry. The desperation in their eyes, the pleading in their voices, was all I needed to understand. They were trapped because their story had never been heard. They needed to be remembered, not just by me, but by the world. Their deaths, their exile, they needed to be acknowledged. A sense of purpose, a strange clarity, swept over me. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't some great, heroic act that would banish the spirits forever. It was something much simpler, yet infinitely more powerful. I needed to bear witness to their pain and give it a voice. The curse would not end with an exorcism or ritual, it would end with a promise to remember. I turned to face the spirits, taking a deep breath. They watched me, their expressions filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The air had gone cold again, but this time it was different. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't suffocating. It was the cold of sorrow, the cold of grief, the kind of chill that creeps in when all warmth has been drained from the world. "I will remember you," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "I will tell your story. The world will know what happened to you." The man who had first spoken to me nodded, his eyes softening for the first time since I'd encountered him. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking, a tear-like vapor forming where his eyes had been. "Tell them, we were not monsters. We were just trying to survive." I nodded, and as I did, something shifted in the air. The oppressive weight I had felt earlier started to lift, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. It was as if the ghosts had heard my promise, as though they were finally beginning to trust me, to believe that I was truly there to help them. But it wasn't enough yet. There was still something more I had to do. Something I could feel deep within me, a lingering sense that their pain could not be fully alleviated with words alone. I couldn't simply promise to tell their story. I needed to give them something more. Something real. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since I arrived, I let go of all my fear. The terror that had gripped me for days seemed to fade, replaced by a deep empathy. These spirits were no longer just ghosts, they were victims. They were humans, like me, who had suffered. "I will give you a voice," I said softly. "I will make sure the truth is told. I swear it on my life." At that moment, I felt something strange, almost as though the temperature of the room shifted yet again. The air grew warmer, and the figures of the spirits began to flicker and blur. For a moment, I thought they might vanish altogether. But instead, they began to solidify, becoming clearer, their outlines more defined. It was as if they were being drawn closer to the world of the living, pulled by the gravity of my words, of my promise. But even as they began to manifest more clearly, a sense of finality settled over the room. I could sense it, their time had come. They didn't need to linger here any longer. The curse was breaking, not because I had performed some grand ritual, but because I had given them what they had been denied all those years, the chance to be heard, to be remembered. And with that, they began to fade, slowly at first, then more quickly, like smoke dispersing in the wind. As their forms dissipated, I could feel their weight lifting from the farm. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the place began to recede. The ghosts had moved on. I stood there, breathless, as the last of them disappeared, leaving only the echo of their voices in the still air. I had done it. I had broken the curse. The exiles were free. But I knew this was only the beginning. There was still much to be done. The world would hear their story, as I had promised. I would make sure of it. The ghosts had finally found peace, but their tale, the tale of injustice, of exile, of suffering, would never be forgotten. And neither would I. The moment the spirits began to fade, a profound silence filled the room. The oppressive weight that had clung to every inch of the farm seemed to lift, replaced by an eerie stillness. I stood in the center of the room, my heart pounding, the shattered mirror still in my hand, its sharp edges digging into my skin. I had done it. I had broken the curse. But as the last of the apparitions dissipated, something else started to happen. A shudder ran through the floor, a deep tremor that rattled the walls. The temperature dropped, and I felt a coldness so intense, it was as if the very air around me had turned to ice. A alarm filled my ears, not the whispers of the ghosts, but something darker, something ancient. I turned, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to ripple and stretch. A figure emerged from the darkened doorway, its form more defined than the others had been. This time, it wasn't one of the exiles, but something else. Something far more sinister. A tall, skeletal figure, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. It stepped forward, and the temperature dropped further. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was pressing in from all sides. The figure's presence was overpowering, and I could feel it gnawing at my sanity. It was a being of the land, the curse's true source. The one who had cast the exiles out and ensured their suffering. And now, it was here to claim its final victory. You think you've freed them? The figure's voice was low, like the groan of 1,000 years of suffering. You think they are free? No. They are mine. All of them. And now you will join them. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. I could feel the weight of its words, a crushing pressure that threatened to collapse me under its force. The air around me felt alive, twisting, suffocating. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing until they pressed against my body. The spirits of the exiles were gone, but in their place, something much darker had arisen, something that would not allow me to escape so easily. I could feel it now. The price of helping them. The cost of breaking the curse. I looked around, desperate, but there was no way out. The windows were sealed shut, and the door was locked tight. The only thing between me and the entity was my own will. You cannot escape, it hissed, its voice dripping with contempt. You have made your choice. Now you must pay the price. In that moment, I realized the true nature of the choice before me. I had broken the curse, yes. The exiles were freed. But the cost was not just my life, it was my very soul. The spirits had been released, but the land demanded a payment. A sacrifice. The entity was a guardian of the land, a force that thrived on the suffering it caused. It would not allow me to leave, for I had undone what it had created, what it had nurtured for centuries. It would drag me into the darkness, pull me into the curse's depths, and I would become yet another tortured soul, wandering the farm for eternity. But there was another option, a choice that terrified me to my core. If I stayed, if I helped the spirits one final time, if I gave myself completely to the curse, to the land, it might release me from its grip. My life would be forfeit, but it could ensure that the spirits were never pulled back into the torment they had endured. They could move on, free of the curse forever. The entity watched me, its hollow eyes gleaming with cruel amusement, as if it already knew what my decision would be. It was offering me a deal, but at the cost of everything I had left, my life, my soul, my future. I could run. I could try to escape, to find a way out of this nightmare. But I knew it was pointless. The land was cursed, and I was caught in its web. The more I fought, the more the entity would tighten its grip. It would consume me, drag me into the shadows, until I was nothing more than a whisper in the wind, a forgotten soul. Or I could make the ultimate sacrifice. The decision weighed on me. A choice that would define my entire existence, that would decide the fate of the spirits who had been trapped for so long. I could escape, run for my life, and leave them behind to suffer again. Or I could give myself to the land, to the curse, and ensure that they were free forever. I closed my eyes, a wave of cold sweat running down my spine. I could hear the echoes of their voices in my mind, those tortured souls, begging for recognition, for peace. I could still see their faces, still hear their words. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. With a final breath, I stepped forward, my body trembling with fear. "I will stay," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I will stay, and I will ensure you are free." The entity let out a deafening roar, its form twisting, its eyes burning with fury. But I didn't back down. I had made my choice. The spirits had suffered for too long, and I would be the one to give them the peace they so desperately needed. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt a sharp pain pierce through my chest, as if the curse itself was claiming me. But I didn't falter. The light in the room began to flicker, and I could hear the soft whispers of the exiles, their voices growing louder, more insistent. "Thank you," they whispered, their voices blending together. "You will not be forgotten." And as I felt the final threads of my existence unravel, I knew that they had been freed, that my sacrifice had been worth it. In the end, I wasn't just the one who had broken the curse. I was the one who had given them the peace they had been denied. And as my consciousness faded, I knew that I would always be a part of their story, forever entwined with their fate. And the land, silent at last, was free. The night had fallen once more, and the farm had never felt more oppressive. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the decaying walls and empty fields. But there was no peace tonight. There would be no rest. I could feel it deep in my bones, something had changed. The atmosphere was different, heavier, charged with a malevolence that seemed to pulse through the air itself. The whispers had returned. Not the quiet murmurs I had heard in passing, but a loud, relentless barrage of voices. Echoes of the past, the screams of the exiles, longing for release, but now demanding something more. Something darker. Their voices seemed to swirl around me like a storm, a swirling vortex of confusion and anger. I stood in the center of the farm, the old wooden floor creaking beneath my feet, the walls closing in as if they could sense my fear. The weight of the house, of the land itself, seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. It was suffocating. I could barely think through the din of the voices, the crashing sounds, the banging doors, the scraping of nails on wood. The air was thick with the scent of decay and dust. "Leave, leave, leave," they chanted. "We are trapped, and so will you be, trapped forever." My pulse quickened. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what was happening. I had helped them, hadn't I? I had freed them from their suffering. Or so I thought. But now I realized there was more to this. The curse wasn't broken. The spirits had been freed, yes, but something had lingered. Something that still wanted to torment, to claim, to destroy. And it was coming for me. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and stretched, forming shapes that didn't belong. Figures emerged from the darkness, tall, gaunt, their faces hidden by hoods and veils, their bodies flickering like flames, phantoms of a past long dead. They moved toward me, their eyes empty, their mouths stretched in silent screams. I couldn't breathe as they surrounded me, cutting off my escape. I backed away, stumbling as my legs felt like lead. The voices grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the sound of feet dragging across the floor, the unmistakable creak of bones that hadn't moved in centuries. The chill in the air became unbearable, and I could feel my body shaking, my teeth chattering. One of the figures stepped closer, its form coalescing from the shadows. It was the figure of a man, his face twisted in pain, his eyes hollow, vacant. His mouth opened, and his voice came out as a tortured rasp. "You thought you could save us? You thought you could end it? We were never meant to be saved." A cold, bitter laugh echoed through the room, and suddenly the others joined in, their voices all merging together in an overwhelming cacophony of madness. The laughter turned into screams, howls of anguish and rage that rattled the very foundations of the farm. "You cannot leave," they screamed. "You are ours. Forever ours." I felt the walls close in, the ceiling lowering, the floor sinking beneath my feet. The room seemed to warp and twist, the edges of reality blurring as if the farm itself was alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The spirits, no longer the lost souls I had tried to help, now became a force of malevolent wrath. They were angry, not just for their exile, but for the hope I had offered them, the hope that had now shattered. I ran, stumbling over the broken floorboards, but the house seemed to shift around me. Every door I tried to open slammed shut in my face. The windows were barred, the glass cracked, reflecting only the distorted versions of myself that I didn't recognize. Each reflection seemed to mock me, twisting and contorting, laughing at my futile attempts to escape. The floor beneath me groaned, and I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. I could hear their footsteps now, the heavy, dragging steps that were moving closer, coming from all directions. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the noise only grew louder, filling my head with a maddening chorus of voices. I couldn't think, couldn't focus, only the overwhelming need to escape, to get away, to survive. I looked toward the door, the only way out, and saw something that made my heart stop. A figure was standing there, silhouetted in the dim light. Its face was covered, but I could see the outline of its body, a figure tall and imposing, its shadow stretching across the entire room. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. The whispers died down, replaced by a soft, sickly voice that reverberated through my bones. "You cannot escape. You were never meant to. I felt the air shift, the temperature drop, and the room became a blur of shifting forms, flickering shadows, and distorted faces. The ground beneath me felt like it was crumbling, like the very foundation of the farm was giving way to something darker, something ancient. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had been drawn into something far beyond my understanding. I had opened a door that could never be closed, and now there would be no escape. The finality of it washed over me like a wave, a sense of inevitable doom that left no room for hope. The spirits, once trapped, were now the hunters, and I was the prey. And no matter how hard I tried, I knew the end was drawing near. I was going to die here. There was no escaping the wrath of the past. No surviving the ghosts of the exiles. I could only hope that, in the end, they would finally find peace. The world around me seemed to have collapsed into darkness. I could no longer tell if the tremors beneath my feet were the house settling or the earth itself quaking in response to the spirit's rage. The air felt thick, as though it were charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heartbeat race. There was no escape, no place of refuge. My legs were frozen, unable to move, my mind overwhelmed by the cacophony of whispers and wails. But somewhere in the chaos, a single thought pierced through. I had to understand. The only way to survive, to even hope for escape, was to understand what had happened here. Why were these spirits so angry? What kept them bound to this cursed place? And most importantly, what was it that I had missed that had set them on this destructive path? I had tried to flee, tried to fight, but it was clear now that there was no running from this, no evading the inevitable. I had to confront it head on, no matter the cost. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the oppressive weight of the supernatural forces around me. I needed silence, clarity. And then, a single thought appeared in my mind, as if summoned by some unseen force. Communicate with the leader. They hold the answers. For the first time since the horrors had begun, I felt a strange sense of purpose. The leader. The figure who had first appeared to me, the one whose voice had been clear and chilling. The one whose presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of finality. I took a trembling breath, and somehow, the world around me seemed to grow still for a brief moment. The whispers quieted, and the flickering shadows receded slightly. The temperature dropped even further, and then, a voice. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. You seek answers. It was the same voice that had spoken before, the voice of the lead spirit, the one who had been tormenting me since my arrival. This time, there was no mocking, no anger. Only a deep sadness, an aching sorrow that seemed to emanate from the words. You wish to know why we suffer, why we cannot rest. I nodded, despite myself, my throat too dry to speak. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I had no choice. The answers were here, and only by facing the truth would I have any hope of surviving this night. The shadowy figure stepped forward. This time, it was more solid than before, its form gaining clarity, though still cloaked in the darkness of the room. It was taller than any human should be, its limbs long and thin, its movements unnatural yet graceful. The voice came again, softer, more sorrowful. We were betrayed. The words were heavy, as if they carried the weight of centuries. Exiled for crimes we did not commit. Cast out by those who were supposed to protect us. Left to die in this forsaken place. I felt a chill run through me as the weight of those words settled on my shoulders. Betrayed. Exiled. The reason for their unrest became clearer, but the pain in the spirit's voice sent a shiver down my spine. These weren't just the words of the dead, they were the words of those who had suffered injustice, those whose lives had been torn apart without cause. We did not deserve our fate, the spirit continued, its tone shifting slightly. But we were condemned, without trial, without mercy. The ones who cast us out. The spirit paused, as though gathering the strength to speak further. There was a long silence, and then the words came, sharp and bitter. They are still here. Among you. Their blood is on the land. The curse, it will not end until justice is done. Until those who wronged us are held accountable. The room seemed to spin as the weight of this revelation sank in. My breath hitched, and I staggered backward, trying to make sense of what the spirit was telling me. The curse, it wasn't just about the spirit seeking peace, it was about revenge. The betrayal they had suffered wasn't just a past tragedy, it was an ongoing wound. The wrongdoers, the ones who had exiled them, were still alive, still connected to this place. And until they were brought to justice, the spirits would never rest. You, the spirit's voice faltered, as though it were searching for the right words. You have the power to break the curse. But you must face them. You must find the truth and reveal it to all. Only then will we be freed. Only then will we find peace. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the implications of the spirit's words took hold. The ghosts had not just been seeking release from their torment. They had been waiting for someone to uncover the truth, to expose the real reason behind their suffering. And now, that burden had fallen on me. I had no idea how I would do it, but one thing was clear. If I wanted to survive this night, if I wanted to leave this place, I had to seek out those responsible for the exiles' deaths and force them to face the consequences of their actions. But as the shadows closed in around me once more, I couldn't help but wonder, could I even survive long enough to uncover the truth? I stood in the center of the farmhouse, trembling, my mind racing. The spirit's words echoed in my ears, you must face them. You must reveal the truth. Only then will we be freed. I had no clear plan, no solid path to follow. How could I? The land was cursed, twisted by the betrayal of the past, and my own fear was closing in on me, as if the walls themselves were alive, pressing against me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes and took a slow, shaky breath. I had to do this. I couldn't allow myself to falter. If I didn't, if I failed, I would be consumed by this curse, just like the others who had come before me. The spirits would claim me, and I would be lost forever. I had to find the strength, the courage, even if I wasn't sure where to find it. The ritual the spirit had spoken of was the only way to break the curse. It was my only chance to stop the relentless terror that had gripped this place. The instructions had been clear, simple in their execution, but the very thought of performing it sent shivers through my spine. I had never believed in this kind of thing before. Never believed in the supernatural, in curses, in rituals. But now, standing on the threshold of my own destruction, there was no other choice. The room seemed to close in on me as I moved to gather the items needed for the ritual, candles, herbs, a circle of salt. Each item felt heavier in my hands as I placed it on the ground. I could feel the air growing colder, as if the temperature was being drained from the room, leaving only a bone-deep chill in its wake. The whispering voices returned, louder this time, almost mocking. You are nothing. You cannot break what has been made. I could almost hear their laughter, distant and cruel. The oppressive atmosphere pressed in on me, thick and stifling. The air felt heavier with each step, as though the very space was trying to swallow me whole. The shadows seemed to move around me, flickering and stretching, hiding in every corner, watching. "Do you really think you can stop us?" they taunted, their voices low and menacing. "You are just a mortal. Weak. Fragile." My hands trembled as I knelt to set the final piece of the ritual in place, the small, delicate symbol I needed to complete the circle. My breath caught in my throat as I felt something icy, brush past my face, and I froze, my heart pounding. The sensation was so real, so tangible, as though the air itself was alive, watching me. My skin prickled, my heart raced faster, and I could feel the weight of every unseen eye upon me. I gripped the edge of the symbol tightly, trying to steady my shaking hands, but the fear was relentless, clawing at my insides, threatening to break me. "No," I whispered to myself, a faint flicker of resolve sparking in the darkness. "I can do this. I can end this." The ritual required me to speak the incantation aloud, to summon the spirits one final time. But every word felt like a weight too heavy to bear. I could hear their voices now, louder, insistent, swirling around me like a storm. "Foolish mortal. You think you can banish us?" one voice hissed. "We are eternal. We will never leave." I shook my head, squeezing my eyes shut. The fear clawed at me, but I couldn't afford to give in. Not now. The spirits were right in one regard. I was just a mortal. Weak. Fragile. But there was something else in me, something stronger, a drive to survive, to make it out of this nightmare. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the circle I had drawn on the floor, fragile, imperfect, but a symbol of the only hope I had left. The flickering candles cast long shadows around the room, making everything feel even more unreal, more distorted. I placed my hand on the center of the symbol, my fingers icy against the cold floor. I could feel the tremor in my fingertips as I whispered the first words of the incantation, the ancient language I had never known, but somehow I knew it. It came from deep within, rising to my lips without thought, as if the words themselves had always been there, waiting. As the first syllable left my mouth, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, reacting to the power in the words. The whispers from the spirits grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to stop me, trying to drown me in their rage. "You cannot do this. Stop now. Stop." But I kept speaking, each word steadying my resolve, pushing back the fear that threatened to overtake me. The coldness grew, and with it, the pressure on my chest became unbearable, as though the very house itself was trying to crush me. I reached the final words of the incantation, and as I spoke them aloud, I felt a violent surge of energy rip through the room. The lights flickered and the ground beneath me trembled. The walls seemed to cave in, and for a moment, I feared everything would come crashing down. But then, the room went silent. And for the first time since I arrived at this cursed place, I felt stillness. The oppressive weight lifted, the whispers faded, and the shadows retreated. The air felt warmer, less suffocating, and the earth beneath me felt steady again. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. And as I stood there, waiting for the next moment, the feeling of dread returned, stronger than ever. "It's not over," I thought, my heart sinking. Something was wrong. Something still lingered. The ritual may have begun, but the battle was far from finished. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I stood frozen, eyes wide, my heart hammering in my chest. The ritual had not ended it, not truly. It had only made the air thicker, more suffocating. A tense quiet now gripped the farmhouse, but beneath that silence, I could feel the spirits, watching waiting. I had done something, yes, but the curse was far from broken. I could sense that the ghosts were only growing stronger, as if my actions had only enraged them further. The walls of the house began to shift again. The shadows started to stretch, becoming unnaturally long, moving with a life of their own. The temperature plummeted, a biting cold that clung to my skin like ice, making every breath feel sharp and stinging. A low rumble reverberated through the floorboards, like the sound of something ancient awakening. Then, the whispers returned, louder this time, piercing, shrill, like the wind screeching through cracked windows. You think you can escape? You think you can break the curse? Their voices came in unison, a chorus of resentment and rage. You cannot run from us. We will have our revenge. You will join us in torment. I staggered back, panic rising in my throat. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with malevolence. The spirit who had spoken to me earlier, the leader, appeared again, but this time its form was no longer just an apparition. It was solid, real, looming before me like an unholy presence. Its face was a mask of anguish, twisted with the suffering of centuries. You tried, it whispered, its voice now a rasping hiss. But you failed. You are one of us now. There is no escape. I turned, looking desperately for any way out. The door was just a few feet away, but the shadows had swallowed it whole. There was no escape. No way to flee from this nightmare. You brought us here, the spirit continued, its voice rising, and now you must pay the price. I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes darting between the figures that began to materialize, more of them now, their faces distorted with pain, their forms flickering like flame in the wind. The air crackled with the intensity of their rage. The room was no longer just a house. It was a battlefield, a place where the dead and the living collided, where the past and present converged in a horrific clash. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to find a way out, but the walls had become a prison. The shadows closed in from every angle, squeezing the breath from my lungs. There was nowhere left to hide. What do you want from me? I screamed, my voice cracking. What do you want? The leader of the spirits stepped closer, its form more solid now than ever. I could almost feel its icy breath on my skin, and I could see the twisted malice in its eyes. You cannot leave until the truth is known, the spirit said, its voice now filled with an unbearable weight. You will expose the ones who cast us out. You will bring them here, and only then will we find peace. My mind raced. I had to make a choice. The curse wasn't just about me surviving the night, it was about the ghosts, about breaking their chains, ending their torment. But in doing so, would I survive? Would I become a part of their haunting, doomed to walk this earth as they had, filled with rage, unable to rest? The decision was crushing. The spirits didn't just want peace. They wanted revenge. They wanted closure, and they were willing to drag me into the depths of their suffering to get it. To expose the truth meant confronting the living, those who had exiled them, and I didn't even know who they were, let alone how to reach them. The fear that gripped me now wasn't just the fear of death, it was the fear of becoming one of them. As the figures circled around me, their presence heavy and suffocating, I felt the weight of their anger press down on me, crushing every ounce of hope. They didn't want justice, they wanted vengeance. And they would do anything to make me part of their torment. I glanced around, my thoughts spiraling, looking for something, anything, that could help me. And that's when I saw it. The mirror on the wall. The same mirror that had haunted me since the beginning. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a gateway, a portal to the past, to the moment of their exile. With a sense of rising clarity, I realized what I had to do. The mirror was the key. It wasn't just showing me my reflection, it was showing me the truth. If I could find the courage to face the moment of their betrayal, to witness it fully, I might be able to break the curse, or at least make it stop chasing me. The spirits were growing more agitated now, their voices rising in fury, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I had to face it. The mirror's surface rippled like water, the image inside twisting. I stepped forward, slowly, my heart racing, my body trembling from both fear and determination. I placed my hand on the cold glass, and suddenly, everything changed. The room around me seemed to dissolve, replaced by a scene I had never seen before, the farmhouse, but not as it was now. This was the past. The people who had once lived here were gathered in the fields, faces solemn. And there, in the distance, I saw them, those who had betrayed the spirits, the ones who had condemned them to their fate. The vision was clear now. I could see their faces. I could see the injustice that had been done. The betrayal, the exile, the death. The truth I needed was there, in that moment. But it wasn't just about the truth, it was about making it known, making them pay. I turned, facing the spirits, and I knew what I had to do. This was the final battle. The final choice. I could expose the truth, bring the culprits to light, or I could run, let the terror continue. But the consequences of both were terrifying. The spirits would get their vengeance, but what would happen to me? As I stepped toward the threshold of the mirror, ready to face the past and expose it, the spirits screamed in fury. I knew they were desperate, but so was I, desperate to survive, desperate to end this torment once and for all. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escaping the past. There was no running from it. There was only the choice to confront it, no matter what the cost. The air crackled, thick with the weight of centuries-old anger. The spirits circled around me, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their forms flickering with the intensity of their torment. I could feel their presence tightening like a vice, suffocating the room. The mirror, the gateway to their tragic past, shimmered before me, offering a glimpse into the truth that had haunted this place for so long. I had made my choice. The ritual, however flawed, had been my attempt to break the cycle. To release them, to free myself from their grasp. But as I stood before the mirror, I could see now that it was never going to be that simple. The weight of their collective suffering pressed on me, and I could feel the pull of the curse tightening around my chest. The figure of the leader spirit stepped forward, its form now almost solid, impossibly close. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just an apparition. It was real, and it was angry. "You think you can fix this?" it hissed, its voice seething with bitterness. "You cannot undo what has been done. We are bound to this place, and you are too." I could hear the desperation in its voice, but there was no going back. This was it. The truth had been revealed, the past lay bare. The betrayal, the exile, the injustice, they were all clear now. But even with the knowledge, even with the understanding, it didn't matter. The spirits were not seeking closure, they were seeking vengeance. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I held the mirror in front of me. The spirits screamed in unison, the sound like the tearing of fabric, a ripping of reality. I had to finish what I had started, no matter the cost. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing: I couldn't leave this place without confronting them, without ending it. The mirror began to pulse with light, the reflection distorting as the spirit's power surged, their anger manifesting in waves of oppressive force. My legs felt weak, my heart racing as I stepped forward, ready to face the consequences. But something went wrong. A violent gust of wind slammed into me, knocking the mirror from my hands. The glass shattered on the floor, splintering into 1,000 pieces, each fragment reflecting twisted versions of myself, of the spirits. The figures screamed, their forms becoming blurry, writhing with distorted shapes. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the very walls groaning, as if the house itself was being torn apart. I stumbled back, my vision blurring, dizziness washing over me. The spirits were no longer just whispers, they were everywhere, their presence overwhelming. They surrounded me, their hands, cold and invisible, gripping at my skin, pulling at my soul. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. The ones who had exiled the spirits. They had come, finally, as if they were summoned by my act of defiance. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, but their presence was undeniable. They were the reason this place had become a prison. The reason the spirits had never found peace. The reason I had ended up here. The spirits turned their fury on them, but something unexpected happened. The lead spirit, the one who had tormented me the most, paused. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something like recognition, like understanding. But then, just as quickly, that recognition turned into something darker. The spirit's form rippled, and with a final, guttural scream, it lunged forward, not at the exiles, but at me. I had no time to react. The force of the spirit's wrath slammed into me like a tidal wave, ripping through my body, tearing at my very essence. I felt a sharp, excruciating pain in my chest, as if something vital was being ripped from me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything blurred. And then, in the space between breaths, there was a sudden calm. I opened my eyes, but the world had shifted. The house was gone, replaced by a barren, fog-filled landscape. The spirits were silent now, their anger quieted, but there was no relief. The weight of the curse still clung to me. The tragic truth was clear, the spirits had not been freed. In their fury, they had taken something from me. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. My body was not my own. I had lost something essential. Something that had made me human. I looked down at my hands, now translucent, like a reflection in water, barely holding onto the edge of existence. I had succeeded in confronting the spirits, in exposing the truth. But at what cost? The curse was not broken, not fully. The spirits had taken what they needed. And now, I was one of them. The exiles had not just claimed their vengeance. They had claimed me. And as the mist closed in around me, I realized the horrible truth: there was no escaping this place. Not for them, and not for me. I was now part of the farm's haunting. Part of the endless torment that would never end. The final night was over. But it had not set us free. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the weathered walls, casting a pale glow across the floor. It was almost peaceful, an eerie calm settling over the farm as the night's torment began to fade into the past. The oppressive weight that had filled the house was gone. The whispers, the shuffling footsteps, the cold breath on my neck, everything had disappeared. The house, once suffused with anger and sorrow, now seemed almost empty. I stood in the center of the room, disoriented, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The farm was quiet, too quiet. The spirits were gone, but there was no sense of relief. The silence left a void, a strange emptiness that I couldn't shake off. My mind spun with fragmented memories of the night, the confrontation, the terror, the overwhelming feeling of loss. The mirror, shattered on the floor, seemed to lie still, its jagged edges reflecting nothing but darkness. But it wasn't just the glass that had shattered, something inside of me had broken as well. I could still feel the touch of the spirits, their presence lingering in my mind. The images of their tortured faces, the final act of defiance, their revenge. And that terrible moment when they took what was left of me. I didn't know if I had been free from the curse or if I had become a part of it. Was I still alive? Or had I crossed over, just like them, trapped forever in the fog? My chest felt hollow, as though something vital had been torn away. I could feel the hollowness in every breath, in every step. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something deeper. I had survived the night. But at what cost? What remained of me after what I had witnessed? After what had been taken? As I left the farm, stepping outside into the early morning light, the world felt different. The trees, the sky, the ground beneath my feet, all of it seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't that I hadn't expected the sun to rise, but everything felt alien now. Like I had crossed some unseen threshold. I had hoped the dawn would bring some kind of closure, some sense of peace, but the only thing I could feel was the weight of what I had experienced. The world around me seemed so empty. The local townspeople had already begun to gather at the edge of the farm, their curious glances lingering as I made my way toward the road. They whispered among themselves, no doubt speculating about what had happened to me, about why I had returned. But none of them would ever understand. No one would. How could they? How could anyone comprehend the depth of the terror I had lived through? How could they know the ghosts I had faced, the decisions I had been forced to make? I passed the broken down gate as I walked away, the memories of the night still clawing at my mind. The farm behind me was quiet now, but it wasn't truly gone. The spirits hadn't disappeared. They had just moved on to other places, other corners of the earth, but their presence would always be there, waiting for the next unwitting soul to stumble onto their path. The exiles had been driven by their anger, their desire for vengeance. But in the end, I realized it wasn't just vengeance they sought. It was acknowledgement, recognition of their suffering. And, despite all I had been through, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for them. They had been wronged, exiled in a time when the world was too cruel to offer them mercy. And as I left the farm behind, I knew something else, something darker. The curse had not been broken. The spirits hadn't moved on. They were still out there, waiting for the next one, for the next person foolish enough to enter the place of exiles. The dawn had arrived, but the nightmare was far from over. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked away from the farm, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air, crisp with the early morning chill, did little to ease the tightness in my chest. I had made it out, but the world around me felt distant, as though I were moving through a dream. My eyes scanned the empty road ahead, but I couldn't escape the suffocating memories that clouded my mind. The whispers, the shadows, the coldness, they all followed me, clinging to the corners of my consciousness like an insidious fog. I had left the farm, but the farm had not left me. The sun had risen, but its warmth felt hollow, as though it were distant, unreachable. The images of the spirits, their agonized faces, their desperate need for recognition, they kept flashing in my mind. Their cries still echoed in my ears, haunting me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just the visual horrors that lingered, it was the feeling. The bone-deep chill, the sensation that I had stepped into something ancient and unforgiving. The weight of their suffering, their unfinished business, had become a part of me. Everywhere I went, I felt watched. It wasn't just the occasional glance of a passerby that made my skin crawl. It was a deeper feeling, a cold, unseen presence. A weight pressing against me from all sides, suffocating the air around me. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, to tell myself that it was over, that I had survived, I knew better. The truth was too clear. I hadn't escaped. Not really. I tried to go back to normal life, to resume my old routine, but everything felt wrong. I no longer fit into the world I once knew. People seemed distant, their voices muffled, like they were far away behind a thick glass. I couldn't focus on anything for long before my thoughts would drift back to the farm, the dusty floors, the shattered mirror, the spirits I had faced. The horrors had become an inescapable part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. At night, when I lay in bed, I could feel the darkness pressing in, the shadows taking shape, their cruel forms whispering just out of reach. It wasn't that I didn't want to sleep. I simply couldn't. The fear that had once gripped me in the farmhouse had taken root inside my mind, turning it into a prison of its own. The dreams, if they could be called that, were worse than the waking hours. The farm was always there, just beyond the veil of sleep. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the same oppressive presence I had felt in the dead of night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling of being trapped. And in those moments, I knew the truth. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, the farm would always be with me. It would always be inside me. I went to the doctors, told them about my sleepless nights, the intrusive thoughts, the unshakable anxiety. They said it was trauma, that I had experienced something terrifying, something I hadn't fully processed. They gave me pills to numb the panic, to make the memories fade into the background. But the pills did nothing. They only made me feel further removed from reality, like I was floating above my own life, watching it happen from a distance. Nothing could make it stop, the memories, the fear, the feeling of being followed. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that the ghosts, the spirits, were just figments of my imagination, a product of isolation and fear. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The truth was undeniable. The farm, its cursed history, the exiles who had died in torment, they weren't just stories. They were real. They were alive in some way, their presence forever etched in the dark corners of my mind. And as much as I tried to push it away, to pretend it didn't matter, I couldn't escape the certainty that they were still with me, waiting. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just behind me. The ghosts didn't need to be present to haunt me. They had already taken root inside me, their cold touch lingering in the corners of my vision, in the deepest parts of my thoughts. I had left the farm, but I would never truly leave it behind. I was marked now, and no matter how far I went, the shadows of the exiles would follow me. Forever. The road ahead stretched on, winding through fields that seemed to blur together, the same as they always had. But everything had changed. The farm, that forsaken place of nightmares, was still there, somewhere far behind me. The rusty gate, the decaying house, hidden now behind the trees, lost to the world as the land faded into obscurity. And yet, no matter how much distance I put between myself and that place, I could never erase it from my mind. It wasn't just a place. It was an experience. A part of me, now. The future of the farm was uncertain. I had heard the locals whispering about it, about how it had sat empty for years. No one ever dared go near it. The stories of the spirits, the exiles who had once lived there, had kept everyone at bay. Would it stay abandoned, left to decay into nothing, or would someone else, some other soul, find themselves drawn to its cursed soil? I didn't know. I didn't care. What mattered now was how I had changed. I thought about who I had been when I first arrived in Maryland. A stranger looking for solitude, trying to escape the mess of my past. I had been running, looking for a place to hide, a fresh start. And at first, the farm had seemed perfect, a quiet, isolated spot far away from everything I thought I wanted to forget. But now, looking back, I realized it wasn't the farm I was escaping from. It was myself. The farm had become a mirror, reflecting all the things I had buried deep inside. It showed me the darkness, the fear, the helplessness I had never allowed myself to confront. The spirits, the exiles, they hadn't just been lost souls. They had been reflections of my own isolation, my own hidden anguish. They had been my deepest fears made manifest. And somehow, in that twisted, unnatural way, I had learned more about myself than I ever could have imagined. The fear I had felt was real. The terror, the crushing dread, had been overwhelming. But beneath it all, I had discovered something else. A strength I never knew I had. The courage to face the unknown, to confront something far beyond the realm of the natural world. And in the process, I had lost something. A part of me, perhaps. Something I would never get back. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked into that farmhouse. The person who had hoped to start fresh, to escape the weight of their past, was gone. In their place was someone else. Someone marked by the horrors they had witnessed, forever changed by what had happened in that place. I wasn't sure what it meant to be free anymore. The ghosts were gone, but their presence had left an indelible mark on me. Every step I took, every thought I had, was tainted by that haunting feeling. The truth I had learned was too heavy to carry. The past, my past, was a part of me now, and I would never escape it. I could hear the whispers in the back of my mind, still. A soft, persistent hum that never quite went away. I thought about the farm, about the spirits who had died there, and the curse that had bound them to that land. They had been victims of a world that had cast them aside, exiled them to suffer alone. And in the end, that curse had been passed on to me, not in the form of the spirits themselves, but in something far more enduring. The sense of their pain, their injustice, now lived inside me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if the farm would ever be reclaimed, if another person would find themselves drawn into its web. What I did know was that I would never be the same. The shadows of the past would always linger, and I would carry them with me, for better or worse. The farm was left behind, its future uncertain. But my future? That, I feared, was already written. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to forget, the exiles would always be with me. They had left their mark. They had left me behind, too. It had been weeks since I left the farm, but the weight of the past continued to cling to me like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I had tried to settle into some semblance of normal life, but there were days when the memories crept back in uninvited, wrapping themselves around my thoughts. I would catch myself staring into space, hearing the distant echoes of those whispers, feeling the cold breath of the exiles on the back of my neck. It had become a part of me, no matter how much I tried to escape it. One evening, as I was walking through town, lost in my own thoughts, I encountered someone new. A man, mid-30s, wearing a weathered jacket and carrying a worn backpack. He had the look of someone who had been traveling for a while, tired, rugged, with eyes that seemed to hold a deep, restless curiosity. He looked out of place here, as if he didn't belong. Our eyes met briefly, and I could sense something about him that was unsettling, like I had seen him before, or maybe like I had been him once. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over, his footsteps slow but purposeful. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "I heard there's an old farm just outside of town. Been abandoned for years, I think. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" I froze, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. The words he spoke were so casual, so innocently asked, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The farm. The same farm. The one I had tried to escape. The one that haunted my every thought. I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. I wanted to warn him, to tell him everything I had gone through, everything I had witnessed. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I forced a smile, a brittle, empty thing that barely touched my lips. "I've heard the stories," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The place is dangerous." He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether I was serious. "Dangerous?" "How?" The words caught in my throat. I had never been good at explaining what had happened to me, what I had seen. How could I explain to someone who had no idea, who wasn't ready to understand, that the place wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed? How could I make him see that the farm had a hunger, a pull that would drag anyone who came too close into its web? "It's just..." I began, but my mind felt too clouded to form a proper sentence. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. I didn't want to make it real for him. "It's not a place you should visit. Trust me." He smiled faintly, a knowing look in his eyes. "I appreciate the warning," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "But I've been looking for something, answers, I think. I've heard the rumors. There's something about that place, something that calls to people like me. You don't know what it's like, not having a place to go, to belong." I wanted to say something more, to stop him before he made the mistake I had made, before he set foot on that cursed land. But something inside me, something dark and haunting, made me pause. I could see it in his eyes, the same restlessness that had once burned in my own chest. The same desire to escape, to find something outside of oneself, something that could provide meaning. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was already lost. That he had already heard the call of the farm, just like I had. Without another word, he turned away and started walking in the direction of the road leading out of town. I stood there, watching him go, unable to stop him. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the inevitable truth. The curse was never going to end. It would always find someone new. Always lure someone else into its depths. The farm didn't need to be abandoned. It only needed to wait. It had all the time in the world, and it would always find another soul to claim. Another victim, another seeker. Just like me. And now, it was his turn. As the figure of the man disappeared into the distance, I felt the pull of the farm again, deep in my chest. The lingering memory of the exiles, their cries for justice, for closure, was stronger than ever. They had marked me, and now, it seemed, they were reaching out to him, pulling him into their endless torment. There was no escaping it. The curse would never end. It would never let go. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many people came and went, the farm would always be there, waiting. Always hungry. Always calling. The days passed after the encounter with the man, but something inside me had changed. I had tried to convince myself that the farm was behind me, that I was free. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, there was always that faint, lingering sense of unease, as if something was quietly watching me from the shadows. It began with the dreams. At first, they were nothing more than fleeting images, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, cold whispers carried on the wind. But then, as time went on, they became more vivid, more real. I could see the farmhouse clearly now, the windows dark, the door ajar. I would walk through the rooms, every step creaking beneath my feet, the air thick with that stifling, oppressive presence. And then, without fail, I would hear it, the sound of a voice, distant at first, but growing louder, closer, until it was right behind me. "You didn't leave," it would whisper, soft and low, almost like a lover's voice. "You never left." I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, breath shallow. I would tell myself it was just a nightmare, that it meant nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, like an invisible thread, still tethering me to that place. The dreams weren't the only signs. One evening, as I sat in my small apartment, reading a book, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A reflection, my own reflection, but different. The figure in the glass seemed distorted, slightly off. For a moment, I thought I was just tired, but then I saw it, a flicker in the corner of the reflection, just behind me, as if something, or someone, was standing there. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Only the empty room. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the unease remained, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I began to find small things out of place, objects moved slightly, as if someone had been in the room while I wasn't looking. Nothing major, but enough to make me question my sanity. It was then, while I was packing away a box of old belongings, that I found it. A photograph, one I didn't remember ever seeing before. It was old, the edges worn and yellowed with age. The image was of a family, standing in front of a farmhouse, smiling, their faces blurred by time. But there, in the corner of the photograph, was a figure that made my blood run cold. It was me. At least, it looked like me, someone with my features, my face, standing among the others, smiling. But it couldn't be. I had never seen this photograph before. I had never been to this place. And yet, there I was, caught in a moment of time I couldn't explain. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the walls pressing in on me as I stared at the photo, unable to tear my eyes away. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the mind? A cruel coincidence? Or had I been there, in some twisted part of the past, bound to the farm in ways I couldn't yet understand? I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. As it fluttered to the ground, the lights in my apartment flickered once, then twice, before plunging me into darkness. I stood frozen, the silence deafening, before I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I wasn't alone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as I turned toward the door, my breath caught in my throat. Someone, was on the other side. I could hear them breathing, their footsteps now just outside the room, a presence that felt as though it had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the stillness, familiar and strange all at once. You never left, it said again, softer this time, like a whisper brushing against my ear. You belong here. You always have. I took a step back, my legs weak beneath me. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls bending with the weight of something ancient, something tied to me. The connection to the farm, the spirits, it wasn't over. It had never been over. The door rattled, as if someone was trying to force it open. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I was no longer sure if it was the farm that haunted me or something deeper, something more insidious that had followed me into this new life. Had I become one of the exiles? Was I now bound to the farm, as much a part of its cursed history as the spirits I had once tried to escape? I didn't know. But the truth was clear, the curse had never been lifted. I hadn't left the farm. It had come with me. The door burst open, and I saw nothing but darkness, an endless void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And as I stepped forward into that abyss, I realized the terrifying truth: I had never truly escaped. The farm was still with me. It always would be.